Hey, everybody. I'm here today with my good friend and colleague, Jake, that I'm really excited to introduce you guys to. You've probably never heard of him because he doesn't have a YouTube channel, even though I have pressured him repeatedly to change that.
Yeah.
Jake is a fellow alumni of the same astrology program that I went through, and he is one of the people in the world that I could probably listen to talk for hours at a time. He's so knowledgeable about so many things. And so I'm really excited to bring him on today and have this discussion with him about the Grail quest, which happens to be one of your areas of specialty. So,
It
Jake,
is.
could you let people know a little bit about yourself and maybe a little bit about your own spiritual background and what you're doing with your koryos Academy, and then we'll dive into the discussion.
Awesome. Well, first off, thank you for having me on. I know it's been a minute coming, so I definitely appreciate it. And as far as myself, I grew up Middle Tennessee, Southern Baptist, joined the military back in 2016, went abroad for a considerable amount of time, and then kind of had experienced a little bit more outside of the realm of just Southern Baptist spirituality that had kind of led me to seek out and try and get some deeper knowledge on some currents and information that I was unaccustomed to. So this led me to looking things like Buddhism, in particular, like Zen Buddhism, Shintoism, while I was in Japan. But that kind of coincided with, I guess you could call it, like the whole explosion of Indo-European studies with the DNA revolution. So I started to get really interested in my own spiritual tradition prior to Christianity and trying to go back to the source, if you will. So that led me down the path of trying to learn what my pre-Christian ancestors were doing and trying to um, figure out where that aligned with my current beliefs and the way I practice. And so I studied religion and philosophy in college after I got out of the military and was able to do a lot of independent study, which was really just all the seeking that I wanted to do, but I was getting graded for it. So that was pretty righteous. And that kind of got me deeper into the more esoteric studies, I suppose you could say. And astrology was something that was continually kind of sprinkled in. So I saw it as a deficiency in myself and took it upon myself to learn that language and then kind of revisit a lot of the studies that I had looked at previously to kind of codify them with that new language that I've been accustomed to. So the the big current that I guess has always been there for me has been kind of the hero's journey, not so much in the Campbell sense, but just kind of where it shows up in mythology. Although I do think Campbell really nailed, kind of how that does show up in many different sources. But really just trying to live that and trying to view the world that I live in and the actions that I do in this sort of mythopoetic sphere, and align myself and my actions and what I pursue within a bigger framework that is oftentimes unseen, I guess you could say. And kind of going back to looking at my own spiritual trajectory, the path of my blood, if you will, prior to Christianity, I noticed a lot of themes with the so-called manor bund or these koryos groups of young men, and that was kind of the vehicle by which we all ended up speaking English, and a lot of the spiritual current that came with that. So uh, I've kind of melded my studies to look at that in particular alongside the Grail quest, which I feel like the chivalric orders that kind of encompass that were a descendant of the koryos tradition, if you will. So that's where
Yeah,
I'm
and
at.
you are really knowledgeable on this topic, and you've been a great resource to me as I've been working on the next episode for the Revolt series, The Soul of Chivalry. So I'm hoping that today we can kind of tie in this koryos tradition, which maybe a lot of people don't know what that is, and the Grail quest, which again, people might not really know what that is. And in some ways they're kind of the same thing. there's
Right.
there's a lot of overlap there. So what is the Grail specifically? How would you define it? Like,
Well,
I know.
there's a lot of ways to define it according to the sources, but the
Yeah.
way I would define it is um, a vessel by which divine and uh, transcendent power is wielded. that it has specific virtues attributed to it that are all in accordance with sacred kingship. So things like reciprocity with the land, obviously virility, and a principle of being rather than becoming. The pole aspect, not so much polar, but polar in the sense of a fixed point upon which everything else revolves. These are all attributes of the essence of the Grail, but the vessel that it occupies changes throughout the sources. And I think this kind of speaks to the deeper esoteric or initiatory understanding of the tradition itself. Very similar and related would be like the philosopher's stone, which is oftentimes described as a stone that is not a stone.
Hmm.
And there's obviously the overlay with that stone could be a body, a person in their spiritual work. Things like tantra, people get into that, and like the sexual alchemy that's involved, or it could be a vessel that is imbued with these powers that when one possesses it, say a crown or a chalice, they are said to possess the qualities of the philosopher's stone or the Grail. So the Grail is not necessarily material, but it can occupy a material sphere, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it is frequently portrayed in different ways. Like sometimes you get it portrayed as a stone or a gem,
Right.
which often has that signification of being that like that center point, the
Mhm.
center of the wheel, that stable axis. But it also has that quality of being like a cup or a bowl or a tray of some kind, which is really more representative of its feminine nature. And
Sure.
I know the Grail is frequently held up to be related to the feminine.
Right.
It has a strong association with women, particularly supernatural women who are kind of, they're sort of said to be guardians of like this lost tradition, and so
Mhm.
they keep it safe, and only somebody who's like really qualified is basically given permission to attain the Grail. So can you talk a little bit more about its connection? Why is it associated with this, with women in particular? Because that quality figures heavily in a lot of the chivalric literature in the Grail sagas. There's always this
Mhm.
this devotion to a woman that comes up.
So the easiest way to think about it is the women are always symbolic, just as everything in good mythology is symbolic. You can't read literally mythology if it's proper myth. There's always multiple layers of meaning. And the traditional world understood this. They understood that to convey complex metaphysical principles, there needed to be symbolic value that was passed along. That when you saw that like a hieroglyph or a symbol, it conveyed a deeper meaning that was not bound by the confines of time and would not degrade as fast as a strictly literal narrative would, because obviously things change with language and culture. So if you take it really far back to uh, the way in which the king was expected to be a steward and representative of the land itself, and in that way was married to the land. The king was the sovereign caretaker and steward, and the one that wielded the power of the land, and by extension of the people. And so, this marriage between the king as the center upon which everything operates to the land in which that is held was paramount. But the value of the woman is that often, obviously, kind of in metaphysics, the earth is seen as feminine, right? It is something that can be cultivated and impregnated to facilitate life. It's the means by which these two forces, the masculine and feminine principle, can generate new birth and new life. And their union in the traditional sense was seen as outside of time, right? Speaking to that kind of unmanifest potential of pure being, where there was a non differentiation before the splitting of heaven and earth, or before the splitting of the two, you know, not genders in the profane sense, but the positive and negative, if you will, like in a energetic sense. And so the king, uh, foremost, had to be qualified to exemplify and carry out his duties in that role, in the role of defender, protector, intermediary between the heavenly forces and the land. And in order to to have those attributes displayed in himself, he had to foremost be qualified. This is often why they would come from, either the priestly or the warrior caste, but usually it was a fusion of the two, at least the further back we go. And so the kind of primordial myth of this separation between heaven and earth requiring an axis mundi to hold the balance, and that central point to bind the two back together upon separation is really the kind of deeper layer of the king and the woman. And so the woman is meant to inspire that in the king, but foremost this usually results in like the erotic or eros inspiration, right? The draw, the desire, which speaks to whether it's the fall or whatever language you would like to use, this profane form of lust. I want to claim this land, it's my land, no one else can have it. That's not quite sacral kingship, but
Yeah.
to be a proper steward and custodian of that land to ensure the prosperity and the bounty of it for one's subjects and for the land itself, that is sacral kingship. So the woman helps to inspire that initial eros tension, which then must be overcome in order to fully rectify the condition of basically a fallen state of man.
And that tension is really significant within these chivalric stories
It's
because
everything.
there's a sense of like actually let me just even see if I have it handy here. So there's a passage in Evelyn's Mystery of the Grail where he basically says, knightly deeds are kind of meant to prove that you're qualified to become a hero. You
Right.
can't let your prideful ego take hold because once that ego takes hold, there's a limitation. But then he gives this second condition, and he says, you can't let this liberation, this detachment, be like a cessation of the tension. And that tension is really kind of in these stories signified by eros. It's the tension between the man and the woman, which is ultimately a stand-in for the tension, the metaphysical tension that always exists between the masculine and the feminine. And that tension has a lot of power in it. If you
Right.
can hold that in balance, not swinging one way or the other, but just bringing them into an equilibrium. And to do that requires being that central point, being that connection between the heaven and earth, between the masculine and the feminine, and that sort of alchemical marriage within the person.
Right. And again, kind of with the idea that myth speaks on multiple layers of reality, right? Um, in again, Hermeticism, alchemy, there's this idea that the great work must be performed across all levels of existence simultaneously. So the temporal, physical element of the body, the mind, and the spiritual component all simultaneously. And this is why they speak to the Grail as one with arms in hand. You have to fight for it. And on a temporal sense, this would be the nightly deeds of heroicism, going on an adventure, the jousting, combat, all these sorts of things. But those are all really, I guess, in an Evolian sense, the lesser holy war. Whereas internally, it's understood that these are all actions mirroring a higher fight, a higher war that the Grail hero is called to, and to possess these attributes and these virtues. One is said to eventually be Lord of Two Swords, so that's conquering both the lesser nature, the physical, the material, but also being able to wield the sword in the spiritual way. And that again gets back to that kind of axis mundi state upon which everything else revolves.
Right. So it's kind of it's really an inner holy war
Right.
ultimately. That like would you say that it's fair to characterize the Grail quest as an inner holy war ultimately?
I think whether we call it the Grail quest or not, it kind of is the holy war, at least in so much as the way Evola lays it out. This kind of nostalgic undertaking to overcome our condition while not entirely being non-existent in the physical world. That's the reason why it's the razor's edge. It's not I'm going to go sit and meditate on a mountain and reject all of existence in the physical plane because I'm aware that there's a higher war at stake that I want to win. That's not quite living. It may be beneficial on a spiritual wavelength, but it's also a rejection of, in the Vedic sense, right? Your svadharma, your personal duty. If you're born into a personal duty, you have an obligation to fulfill it. And although again, like in Vedic society later on in life, the elders were kind of exempt from that. Like, just go wander, be at peace, go sit and meditate on the river of the Ganges and until you die, because you'd fulfilled your dharma at that point as far as what is obligated of you in society. But to be in pursuit of the Grail, at least in the sources, it really does speak to simultaneously fighting both fronts, to do well in life, to overcome the physical limitations and struggles and tests that are prerequisite to being able to do that in the spiritual component, and trying to meld the two and wield the two swords simultaneously is what the Grail winner is able to accomplish.
Yeah, so I kind of have always had the impression that the Grail quest is really an allegory for man's quest for transcendence ultimately. And it's just one form of sort of packaging up those instructions in this very esoteric and coded way.
Right.
Um, and this Grail mythology is really closely tied up with a number of these medieval chivalric orders, and all of which have like a strong esoteric component to them. And those orders seem to descend, at least in part, from this really ancient koryos tradition. So, can you tell us a little bit about what that tradition is and kind of where it originated and what the connection is with the Grail quest?
So, yes, the first thing though to kind of keep in the back of your mind would be necessity, right? So the Grail quests always, whether it's in a historical component with things like the Love Lieges or the Ghibelline forces or the Templars, and pseudo historically with Arthur, there is a call to action. There's a very real, not in some sort of just mystical idea sense, but a very real call to action, and that's crisis, right? The land is in turmoil, everything is barren. The leaders have no qualifications to lead. So essentially, Kali Yuga symptoms, right? And this is what prompts those who are, in the sources it says called by name to the Grail to just suddenly wake up. And each one of the heroes kind of has their own way of being called to it. Obviously, probably the most famous is, Parsifal is pulled away from any of that type of knightly chivalry by his mother. She doesn't want him to die like his father did, and so he's raised in the woods away from it all until suddenly he encounters some knights and it just clicks because he was predestined. That was his fadharma. It was his caste. It was what he was meant to accomplish, and so he's called to action. And I think that call to action is always due in part to some sort of pre-existing state of turmoil and chaos that needs to be rectified and ordered by the Grail quest itself, and then ultimately the possession of those qualities of the Grail. And so, if you take this way, way far back, the koryos tradition, which itself, in my mind, was kind of derived from these ancient mammoth hunters of the Ice Age. But if we focus just on kind of the Bronze Age koryos tradition, what this was there would be an institute, a center of initiation, which was often secluded and often out in the wilderness somewhere away from society. And the young aristocrats of specific tribes or clans would be brought there after usually a period of kind of their father or their uncle. Oftentimes you see the uncle taking on the role as kind of, I'm going to take you under my wing, uh, taking them out hunting, teaching these kind of survival skills, these sorts of things to gradually pull them away from the world of their mother, away from the bosom. And around age 16, the dates kind of change, 16, 20, whatever it may be. But this kind of liminal space between boyhood and manhood, they would be brought to, and they've found, not just in the mythological record, but they've even found archaeological evidence of this in Russia, to a center in which everything was taken from them. And these were, especially if you put your mind in their headspace of, like they're young princes, right? Like they got a chip on their shoulder, they're entitled to some shit. But now they own nothing. Now they are nothing. They're in fact wolves. They're dogs. They're outcasts from their own society, and they were initiated into what probably the more popular term of a Mannerbund, a boys group, a group of men under arms, is what koryos ultimately translates to. And they were ejected into the wilderness. This was often after an initiation ritual in which they would ritually sacrifice wolves or dogs that presumably were raised with them since birth. I'm not advocating for anything like that in the modern time, but just to be historically sound. And they would consume the flesh of these animals and wear their pelts after, thus becoming the spirit of that animal. And in the evidence that's been found archaeologically, these were older dogs that were about the same age of the boys, so you can almost assume they were given to them in youth and they were raised their whole life until finally this rite of passage occurred, and they were ejected from society. And all they had was the wolf pelt on their back and the weapons at their side and their brothers in their koryos. And a game of dice was determined for who would be the leader of the war band. And different groups, different traditions of it, whether it's Iranic or Vedic or Germanic or Celtic, they had different ways of going about this. Obviously, this is a tradition that lasted for a very, very long time, but they would claim new lands, new territories. They would act as kind of a secret police force to defend the territory of the tribes they were from, even though they were considered, banned from those tribes. This was kind of to prove themselves as men worthy of being a man of the tribe. And after a period of time, they would usually come back and have a cleansing ritual, in which they would re-enter society. They would, cut their long hair, cut their beards, and be expected to be the leaders of the societies they came from, having undergone this death of their old selves and been reborn into this tradition of manhood. And so this is also the primary vehicle which carried the Indo-European gene pool into Europe, and with it, its language. And one can assume, as these were very much patrilineal practices, the spiritual component as well. I can't really imagine a world in which these very secret, close knit groups would come to a new area and then just give away all of the ancestral spiritual practices of their forefathers and be like, we're going to practice this now. That probably had some mixing that did occur when, if they would conquer new people or claim new lands to pacify. And in religious studies, you see this a lot of kind of a mixing together of religions. This is ultimately like how Buddhism was formed, was an outgrowth of Hinduism. And then, it's mixed a little bit with the Bon tradition of indigenous Tibet. So you would see some sort of blending occur. But for the most part, this tradition of the young men being brought out into this initiatory place where they were then uh, left to become men. But first, they had to find and access their bestial nature as less than men, as dogs, as wolves, and overcome that state in order to return to regality and essentially the solar principle. Which, it's no coincidence that there's the idea of lycanthropy, right? Howling at the moon. It's the feminine lunar state that has to be overcome, the chaotic nature that dwells within all men, that can be accessed and tapped into and wielded the Shakti power of, but you could also lose yourself in that, and that must be overcome. So as that tradition evolved, it took on new forms, but ultimately my belief is that it turned into the chivalric orders that we see, and they were kind of vestiges of this earlier tradition, which I would trace all the way back to really the Paleolithic, with these first mammoth hunters, the first parties of men to go out and shape a new world by their hands, by slaying a mammoth and quite literally building huts and structures from their bones, and providing nourishment and resources for their people.
It's really interesting how they really took on this wolf symbolism. Like you're literally going to go out and live like a dog, to the point of even dressing in its pelts. And what I find really interesting about that is that the symbolism of the wolf has a really strong link to Apollo, and it comes up like wolf and dog stuff comes up repeatedly in myths that are linked back to a Hyperborean tradition. And
Right.
Apollo, of course, despite being a solar god, he actually has these really close links to the underworld, but he's also like the Hyperborean god, and everybody
Hmm.
thinks of him as a sun god. So can you talk a little bit about how Apollo came to be linked with the symbolism of the wolf? Because this is really important in terms of like kind of tying together the sort of the light and the dark aspects of what this quest ultimately is, which is, eventually like going into the underworld to reclaim the light. And
Right.
that's Apollo's whole thing.
So Apollo, although definitely being a solar deity, he is usually described in terms of far away. Even the idea of him being a Hyperborean deity is quite far from the Greeks that were talking about him, right? So he is the light that's far away but imminent, and that's an important thing to remember because um, it's speaking to something that is not yet here or a call to action yet again, right? There's this crisis. The light's not here, summer's not here, the crops aren't growing. What do we do about it? We go pursue it. We hunt it, right? And so Apollo, in around forgive my Greek, I believe it's Mount Lycaeus. He is
Yeah.
associated with Apollo Lycaeus, and this is Apollo the wolf god. There's a great monograph about this as well you can get. Um, but Apollo in this role has a lot to do with fertility and abundance of the land. And so these young men, these koryos groups, which every European offshoot had its form of, even things like the Spartans and the agoge training were ultimately derived from the koryos. Cattle raids, right? Getting wealth and prosperity and abundance for your kin was usually the paramount thing, but so was this idea of fertility and abundance of the land. Um, in the Vedic tradition, Indra is the leader, the Koryonos of his own warband, the Maruts, and they are ultimately storm deities, right? They bring rains, they bring wind, which provides the nourishment necessary for a good harvest, which is also why, for instance, with Indra, he bursts open the mountain to free the cattle and the sun and restore order. And you see this time and time again in these groups that have this wolf association. Um, and this is because the wolf is symbolically understood to be psychopomp in nature, able to go in between worlds where otherwise you're not permitted. And this is why this place in between death and life, not quite alive, not quite dead, but it's somewhere in between, is really what the entire prolonged period of the koryos was about. You have no lands, you're not part of the tribe, but you have your people you're with, but you're not really building anything yet. So now you have to somehow navigate this dark subterranean element of life or death in a way that has to be overcome in order to reconstitute the order. And so in the Greek tradition, the young men, when they were finished with this training, would they were said to again cut their long hair and donate it to the god Apollo. And at that point, he was the patron of the mature warrior, the general, the commander, the one that was able to wield his martial prowess in an effective way that was leadership oriented and able to bring order and ensure prosperity for the people in his stead. And this is directly linked to the ability to, if you need to have pasture for grazing, well, you have to claim that. And if there's people there, you have to conquer them. You need to be able to constitute the order out of that chaos. But that's just stage one. You have to hold it after the fact, and you have to be able to keep things going. And so, this idea of this far away, lofty goal of the eternal state of Hyperborea, of abundance, and everything is the way it should be. This has to be sought. It cannot just be assumed to come out of nowhere and just rain down abundance on you and you didn't do anything. Oh, thank you, Apollo. No, it requires sacrifice, and it requires wading into that darkness in order to find that, in a very alchemical sense, find that gold within the lead and bring that up to the surface. Um, there's a really interesting case of when they were doing like the witch and werewolf trials of the Middle Ages in Sweden, I believe. Face, I think is the name of Kettleburn. If you look it up, it's pretty interesting. But he gets accused of being a werewolf, right? And he's like a werewolf that worships the devil. And he's like, well, I'm a werewolf, but I don't worship the devil. I'm a hound of God. And they're like, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. He said, no, hear me out. Specific times of the year, and these are all very astrological, seasonal times that have a lot to do with the harvest. Me and my guys, we take on the shape of a wolf and we go into the underworld and we fight the devil and we fight the witches there and we steal back the cattle and we steal back the grain and then we run through the wind and we disperse it to the people. And this connection here to the wind is also very heavily associated with Apollo, because it's not just the faraway sunlight that Apollo represents, but also the swift moving, this aspect of, again, imminent dawn, imminent abundance, but that must be sought. And so uh, that link to spreading that fertility, quite literally running through the town and spreading grains to make the crops grow, is it's an active masculine warrior principle, right? It's not just passive; it's taking on an active role to facilitate that abundance, and that's kind of the carryover from, whether it's Hyperborean or not, it's the carryover from this idea of a god that must be brought out in oneself in a way to take on that role.
What I find really interesting is that there are certain parts of the ancient world where, like, temples to Apollo would be built at caves that were considered to be the entrance of the underworld. And
Right.
there are like whole classes of initiations into the cult of Apollo that involve, going into these caves and lying in stillness and almost like evoking like a sort of dream state and dying before you die. That's like such a big theme across, all of these initiatic, like these solar initiations. And it's like, but why would you go into the underworld if this is a solar path? Like, on the surface, it appears to make no sense. It's like, but
Hmm.
for some reason, there's a reason that we need to go into the darkness in order to find that light. And of course, the darkness is part of creation too. You can't really have wisdom, I guess, if you're going to ignore everything that is dark or scary or
No.
unpleasant, if you're not willing to face the reality of death. So, on that sense, I can kind of see, like, yeah, well, of course you need to go into the darkness to find the light of wisdom, because where else are you going to find it? But I think that's really counterintuitive for people.
It definitely is, especially kind of in the modern sense of this dichotomy of light and dark, and there is uh, the potential for danger there. Like, certainly there are things that one could characterize as chaotic and dark that are in no way, shape, and form beneficial to society or to one's individual spiritual nature. But again, kind of that idea of going into the underworld, and especially when you're talking about Apollo, and the reason I brought up the wind is one of the reasons these caves were associated with the wind and Apollo is because they would quite literally have this rush of wind coming out from these caverns beneath, and that kind of howling void was very much linked to wolves. Obviously, a lot of wolves would leave or live in these caves, but the seasonality of the sun setting and dying for a time until it's resurrected was understood in the ancient world, and this is extremely prevalent in things like Hellenistic astrology, to quite literally go into the underworld. And the Indo-European myths that are associated with this in particular always have an element, and in the reconstructed pie versions, of the heroic twins or some sort of hero going on a quest to the underworld in order to rescue the sun. The sun has been stolen, or she's crashed, or whatever it may be. She needs to be rescued. Dawn needs to be rescued, and throughout the night, brought back to the gates of heaven in order to ensure the cycle of another day. And on a microcosmic level, this takes place with ourselves. We have this spark of inner divinity, if you will, within us that gets banished, it gets cast into the darkness, it sinks, it drops, and oftentimes it is in the place where we would not want to look because we something has happened, whether it's a trauma or it's just life itself that has kind of banished that inner light that requires on a very personal kind of spiritual level, um, seeking it out and resurrecting it and bringing it back to the surface. And when you expand that out, you can see this even in things of like the cyclical nature of the ages, whether or seasonality of the seasons that we see in like the pagan sense, but like in Spengler's view, right? We have the decline of the West. It's faded. All things subject to time and the material forces are going to have atrophy and entropy, and we can't do anything about it. It's faded, and that's sobering. But it also is again that kind of crisis of a call to action because there's always the requirement of the heroes that will go find that light from those ashes, kind of like the alchemical phoenix, which oddly enough, the phoenix and the wolf through Scorpio are heavily related. So we see this theme time and time again of a call to action on the part of heroes in order to ensure that the cycle repeats. And even in the Vedas, it talks about if the sacrifices are ceased, the universe ceases. Like there has to be that reciprocity, and that gets back to that polar aspect of the axis mundi of the divine king, facilitating these sacrifices, facilitating these rites, ensuring that they continue so that things continue. And that doesn't mean that they're going to always continue blissfully, but it means they'll continue, that the reciprocity of life and death will continue.
One thing you said, just kind of in passing, that kind of caught my attention was you mentioned about how they would do these things in the caves, and there's always that whistling of the wind. And, the Parmenides poem on nature, where he's describing his descent into the underworld and meeting the goddess of death and everything, like the only sound he describes in that entire poem is the sound of whistling or hissing,
Hmm.
um, the sound of like a hissing snake, which of course has links to Apollo as
Subterranean
well.
turns, yeah.
Yeah, and the Greek word for a pipe is a syrinx, and it either means like the musical instrument itself or the part of the instrument that makes the piping or whistling sound. And that particular sound was called syrigmos. I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but it's also the same word that they gave for the hissing of snakes.
Hmm.
And that of course has links to the uncoiling of the kundalini and
Right.
getting
And the
into
slaying
that.
of the serpent, which, is allegorical, whether it's that is probably the most prevalent theme in any type of um, Indo-European mythology and folklore is the serpent slaying. Yeah, there's Watkins wrote an incredible book kind of breaking down the poetic dynamics of Indo-European studies called How to Kill a Dragon. And this was really just the central theme, that this primordial serpent that needs to be slain or somehow risen. Even, the early Christian church used this image of the serpent on the rod, rising it above its base nature from the ground. And this hissing, um, it's the breath, right? So the the pre-Socratic philosophers ultimately, all whether it's flux or this kind of ultimate moving breath, seems to be this breath of existence, whether we can call that consciousness or just the movement itself. There's an outflow from which would make sense if we're kind of looking at an undifferentiated whole of being. Once that rupture occurs, once that cracking of the cosmic egg occurs, well, now there's an outward flow, whether the yolk is broken and there it is dripping out. And so this process of breath is always linked very, very heavily to subterranean things, but also, in in yoga, the breath is kind of key, focusing on the breath and noting where the breath is and associating oneself with the breath. um, but the breath is not it's very psychopompic in nature. It's not bound by time and space. It just is. It's recycled. It comes and goes. It enters into the earth. It enters into us. It exhales. And so following that and tracing that and trying to locate those inner centers of breath is ultimately kind of the process of awakening kundalini, or rising these energetic currents from deep within our earth. Again, philosopher's stone, talking about a stone that is not a stone. Well, you're the stone. You're the thing trying to awaken these gold elements within yourself and rise them up your energetic currents. And there's a whole slew of ways to articulate that, but they're all ultimately speaking to this perennial theme of trying to overcome the base nature of oneself and to rise out those higher divine elements, and then reflect them outwardly. So one thing that has really kind of took root in my own mind with this idea of reflection is, in astrology, the moon shapes the environment, right? It really helps to shape the environment. Well, where does the moon get its light? It gets it from the sun. So what kind of light are you shining on that moon? That's going to infect and affect your environment. And if you're doing this in a way that is genuine and trying to be a vessel for these higher divine forces that one is trying to align themselves with, well, then you start to shape your environment in that image. And this is very much the whole central idea of the Grail, is healing the land. There's a maimed king. He's done something wrong. He lost his power. He lost the Grail. He needs to be healed. And if he's healed, this also will heal the land, because the king and the land are one in this sense. But this this is always going to be an internal work foremost, and to align oneself with that internal work in response to the environment one has, and trying to align their actions to that as well. That's really kind of the Grail quest in a nutshell, is trying to bring out that inner light, bringing it out so that one possesses the Grail.
Yeah. I mean, maybe we can talk a little bit about, this whole concept of like the wounded king and the nation that becomes a wasteland and how that relates to the Grail. Because, like, the story of Amfortas, for example, is
Mm.
really, it's really quite a potent lesson
Oh
in
yeah,
terms of what happened to
pride.
him and his failure. I see him as a very Saturnian figure, in the sense that, I mean, for anybody who doesn't know, Amfortas is, the wounded king. He was wounded in his manhood, and, he basically is just lying, languishing, waiting for the hero to come and
And he
correct
and
his
he
error.
can't die because of the residual powers of the Grail keeping him in that
Yeah, he
alive
can't
state, but
die.
he is
He's
in
just
misery.
suffering. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is, it's interesting. In Wolfram's Parsifal, they talk about how the king certainly languishes more during certain transits. They use the Arabic terms for the planets, and this is ultimately because a lot of astrology was saved by the Arabic world, which is something that I think a lot of people don't give proper credit to. But so much of it was trying to be destroyed, and the Arabs actually were able to, because they saw the value in it, these alchemical texts and these early Greek philosophers talking about astrology, and they wanted to preserve that knowledge. And so we see uh, these references to the king suffering under specific planetary alignments. And he himself is most certainly a very, Saturnian figure,
Well, and he
especially
suffers the most under the Saturn transits.
under the Saturn transits, and especially if what is Saturn in the traditional sense? He was the king of the golden age, but now he's at the edge of the known cosmos, and he can observe it all, but he's moving slow, and he's kind of melancholic, and he he knows what's been going wrong, and he's trying to work it out, but he's slow moving and he's old, of course associated with time. And Fortis is very much right there. He can see his wrongs. He can see and he's just desperate for somebody to come and ask the correct question and heal it and restore. But realistically, he probably knows that Parzival, or the Grail Seeker, is gonna screw it up, because he that's part of the journey, is the first encounter with the Grail, the first chance to make things right. They screw it up. And Avola talks about that is almost a prerequisite, because the the hero must possess shame and have the
Mm.
capacity to possess shame for his failure to ask the question, his failure to set things right. And this languish that he begins to feel is mirroring the languish and the pain of the wounded king, because now he understands the suffering of the king. He associates himself with the king. And this is again that kind of idea of the king and the land are one. If you're fully only ever looking at yourself as the center of all being, and everything outside of you is null and void, well, you failed the test of pride. This is like kind of the Luciferian angle of the Grail mythos, I guess in its more Christian sense, is it's all about you. But when Parsifal starts to feel that pain and that sorrow, and he's just so deeply moved by it that he has to complete the task. He even curses God at this point because he's so ashamed. And it's said that throughout the whole rest of the story, really, until he finally makes amends, he's almost doing it against God, because what kind of God would essentially allow that shame to fall on him, and this pain to take hold of the wounded king? But
But
the
that's
wounded
so
king,
critical to the story, the fact that he goes against God like that. It's
right?
like that's
Well,
like
we
the
all
real,
do it.
it's like the shift away from that lunar spirituality of like this devotion to this theistically conceived divine and a
Sure.
dependence on it, and switching over to a more solar orientation and seeking out like this actual heroic reintegration, um, which has, those Luciferian and Promethean themes to it, because there is that rejection of like, I'm not going to worship you, I'm going to become a god myself.
Hmm.
And then of course Parzival gives, that admonishment to Gawain, don't put your faith in God, only think of a
Put
woman.
it in a woman, right? Yeah. And the ultimate kind of realization, because that is kind of the arc, right? Is beginning in this submissive lunar state of subservience to deity, and then something taking place that sparks a crisis that must be overcome, that requires the rejection of that subservience. I'm going to take it upon myself, which, let's take it to a Christian sense, I'm going to bear my own cross, right? To kind of walk that path. And then ultimately, in the resolution form, it's not so much I'm going to become a god, it's that God is going to imbue me with these qualities that I will then abundantly disperse, that I will then be a vessel to carry. And so the whole Grail quest is this process of refining and making sure that individual can actually do that without being a prick. Because if you're getting the power of God or the gods, and you still not learned that it's not all about you, you're going to end up a wounded king. There's going to be some external draw that you desire, that you lust for, that will ultimately be your downfall. And in that way, as we can see with our leaders today, the entire community suffers.
Well, that's essentially like Treverson even gave Parzival the warning of that very thing, and even used the story of Amfortas to warn him against this, the potential for pride, because there's always that way in which that Luciferian path can deviate and become one's downfall. It's the left hand path. It's the walking of the razor's edge, and
Hmm.
one false step and you could be fatally cut. The Grail quest isn't a safe thing to do. It's really dangerous. And if you try to hold the Grail before you're ready, it will destroy you or blind you or suck you into a vortex or all kinds of horrible things. And,
Right.
you know, the fact that it kind of gets into like the whole test of pride, right? And the ability to feel things like shame and honor, and to really be free of your own ego, to not go seeking out to do knightly deeds because you want praise for them and you want all the ladies to throw their handkerchiefs at you, but because you're really seeking that solar path and you're actually seeking to leave this world behind so that you can make that leap into the next world. And so I don't know, do you want to talk about like what actually happened to Amfortas? Because some of the audience might not be familiar with the story.
So there's kind of differing accounts, but the gist of it is pride. He became he wanted to do jousting competitions, or he wanted to win the ladies, but in some sources, there's the dolorous stroke, right? There's this kind of faded, which itself is tied to another prideful instance. I believe it's Balin in the Welsh tales, that for the most part mistakenly wounds the wounded king, but it's because the king had basically left this state of kingship and went back, reverted back to wanting to just be a knight getting the fame, and his price to pay for that is he loses it all. And in some sources, it's he's doing it for the love of a woman that is not his wife. In some sources, he just misses the glory days. It's like kind of like the boomer, like, man, back in high school, I used to. It's almost that, but he forsakes his duties and goes back out into the world, in pursuit of glory, essentially in a prideful sense, and that's his downfall. And I think it's helpful to just look at it as the symbolic value of that rather than fix it, because in the later traditions, obviously you have some Christian overlay, and in the earlier kind of pagan themes, you have things that are specific to those cultures. So if you kind of zoom out and just look for what again is that perennial symbolic value, it's, well, he neglected his duties as king. He left to go seek glory on his own. He paid the price.
Yeah, and it's significant that the woman that he was pursuing, that ultimately kind of resulted in his the fatal wound to his manhood, is, it's not the woman who's for him. And correct me if I'm wrong, but just thinking of the woman as an allegory for like the Grail as well, isn't it the case that the Grail is supposed to have inscribed on it the
The
name
name
of
of
the
your
woman
beloved.
that's your actual soulmate,
Yeah. It's like
your other half?
when Dante goes to rescue or to try and rescue Beatrice, right? It's it's this idea that before material birth, um, the totality of your being was androgynon. It had a male component and a feminine component, which obviously in the Kali Yuga we can see the full inversion of this theme, which I won't harp on too much, but I'm sure
Yeah.
people can understand what I mean. Um, but upon birth, when gender is assigned and this this personality, astrology represented by the ascendant, right, takes hold, there is this other portion of oneself still out there in the world, and Serrano talks about it being very rare to come
I was
across.
just thinking of that, the
Yeah,
whole cosmic egg story at the beginning of
right.
Nos.
Yeah, and I think this, in any really any creation story, this seems to be very much there in the kind of there's a wonderful YouTube channel called Talison's Map. I'll give a little plug for, who just did a great rundown on the proper way to view the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European creation myth and this separation of heaven and earth. But this idea that before we were here, we were face to face with the beloved, which obviously Meister Eckhart and some of the Christian mystics associated with God, and but on the material plane, the Grail Kings are supposed to be with. They found their other half, and they're living in harmony, upholding the sacred masculine and sacred feminine in the respective forms in order to continue the abundance of the Grail. But that's preset for you. It's predetermined, and uh, and yeah, he seeks out from that. No, what's over there? I'm going to go do this jousting competition and win some other woman's favor, and uh, that was the critical miscalculation, is looking out from essentially his other half. That this not in kind of the goofball modern sense, but the 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 face of his soul, as Serrano would put it.
Yeah, and I think the point you made about the sort of inversion that we're seeing today is probably a really good thing to make a distinction between when we're talking about like the myth of the hermaphrodite, where you had that primordial state of union of the masculine and feminine, where they were non-different, they were unified together in a higher form, versus the androgyny and gender confusion that we see today, where people like men are very feminized, or women are very masculinized, and people just, they have no idea what gender they are. Like, that's not union.
It's not union, and
It
it's
can
also
give the
worth
appearance
noting.
of it in an inverted way, but it's very, very
Yeah.
different.
Well, it's also worth noting that these terms, androgynon, hermaphrodite, were the best way of articulating something that is essentially incomprehensible to humanity. We may think we can comprehend God, but we can't. We're not God in totality. We're not um, the the jurators of all truth in the universe. We're ultimately trying to figure it out, right? And so mythology is always trying to convey the deeper truth in the limited capacity of language and symbol, and those by their very nature are degradations of a primordial state. If you can think about it, like a thought form is its pure essence, but the second it's spoken, it's degraded. This is just what happens when things leave their primordial state, and then as they are subject to time and the laws of, the material plane, they degrade and they fall away. And so I don't think it's any coincidence that we see this so prevalent today, especially when, as I've said, the kind of uh, metaphor for America, the West, being the land of the setting sun, and quite literally, we are witnessing the setting of the sun. Everything is starting to get darker, and I think you have to have a pretty lukewarm IQ to be able to not see that. But it would make sense that this gender confusion is so prevalent at that time, because there's less clarity necessarily.
Yeah, so bringing up the setting sun, I made a post recently for Twitter and Telegram, which you saw, and a lot of
Right.
people here probably saw, about the destiny of Western man being to
Yeah.
chase the setting sun. And a lot of people really didn't understand what that meant. But this is a very integral part of what you're talking about with these koryos traditions and this Grail quest, and just the ultimate spiritual destiny of Western kind. And one of the things that people got really upset about was like, oh, well, why are we distinguishing between the East and the West? Why can't we go back to the East? And, I said we'd talk about that a little bit today. And I know you have a lot of thoughts about that, because some of the ways that I've developed my ideas on that have been through conversations I've had with you. So, what do you have to say in regards to why we need to chase the setting sun? Why is this specifically Western man's destiny, and why can we not return to the East?
So I'll put a note out first. This is my own intuition speaking, and hypothetical at best, but I think there's merit to it. So if you look at the Indo-European migrations, for the most part, they went from east to west. Again, these were patriarchal societies, and the principal gene pool, R1A, R1B, Y haplogroups, ultimately is derived from hunter gatherers, mammoth hunters up in Siberia, so pretty far east. But something took place, whether it was, a climate change, who knows, or needing new grazing fields, they started to go westward, and for the most part, it continued westward. And as you kind of trace this koryos tradition and the associated, offshoots of it, it gets further and further west until eventually it reaches the British Isles. And in my argument, what do we see from there? We saw a lot of people leave the British Isles and go further west. And then you have this whole idea of manifest destiny and and all of the Americana themes that were there in the beginning. The pioneering spirit is very much like this koryos spirit of, forever west.
I
But
would
we
even
made
maybe modify that from a pioneering spirit to an imperial impulse.
it is
But
an imperial
but in
impulse.
in modern centuries, like, it's been obviously kind of corrupted into this like colonialism and conquering, rather than the true imperium that we find in the
Right.
world of tradition, which people who follow my channel have obviously heard me talk about
Yeah,
that.
in the
But
evolved sense of imperium, for sure.
that impulse to imperium, which is ultimately the impulse to impose the cosmic order upon the whole world,
Right.
and to have the universal empire headed by the universal ruler, the Chakravartin, the sacred king, whatever you want to call it. And I think that's a really integral part of the Western psyche
It
and
is.
why we do
And
what we do. And also, it becomes this really significant component of that spiritual quest. But
well, it
please carry on.
becomes
Sorry to interject.
no, you're spot on. So it also becomes, in a lot of ways, the serpent to be slain, right? There,
Yeah.
it is. It's obviously appalling and extremely annoying when people just write off any of the actions of their ancestors. I'm fundamentally against that, and obviously there's a tremendous push for us all to do that writ large. However, we should also look at the predicament we're in and the things that have got us there. It's no coincidence that the farthest western reach of America is perhaps the most decadent, the one that has the most corruption. Um, Washington would probably top it, but um, either way, this is the path of action. It was the men of action that ultimately continued that step forward, and really, this would be the heroic impulse, the heroic cast of those who left. And we have to acknowledge that we are their descendants. We can't escape that. And karmically, or I guess fatedly, if you could look at it that way, we can't escape the consequence of those actions.
Right.
And
We have to
so
fulfill it now.
we have to fulfill it. And what always comes after, the long night? Well, a new dawn. But if we get to the very edge where it's darkest, I think about Lord of the Rings when, before Gandalf rides in and saves everybody, right? It's just so dark. It's terrible. Like, it's not going to work. It's all for nothing. Like, what if everybody just packed up and left? And they're like, yeah, it's the end times. It's, and I don't know if it's the end times, for the record, but it's this state of, again, there's a crisis, there's a call to action, and it's the consequence of past actions. Like Odin says, a deed to a deed. And we are here. We cannot escape that fate. And so, especially when looking at things with like the American birth chart, it's kind of interesting to see this kind of
Mm.
rebirth phoenix energy, and they're entwined. And I don't think that's by mistake. Obviously, the founders were occultists and astrologers, but chasing the sun to its furthest extreme uh, is kind of in for Western man, I guess you could say, we're living the Parsifal quest, and there's this inherent anger and rejection of everything that's going on. And trust me, I feel it too. But we also have to recognize that we are meant to pursue past that, to overcome that darkness, and to somehow, some way, find that lost light which crashes over into the western shores and pull it back out, just like the heroes who rescue the dawn from her watery peril, so that we can ensure the rebirth of a new dawn, which then would, in kind of my worldview, initiate the path of return in the sense that Serrano lays out.
Yeah, and I think, there's a symbolic value of thinking of the East as being that path of contemplation and the West as being that path of action. And on a higher plane, those are non different. On a lower
They're
plane,
not.
they appear to be different. And so, my view is that in this chasing of the setting sun, to follow that path, and ultimately what that aims for is that alchemical reintegration, which does then bring the East and West back together on that higher plane. And
Well,
the
it's interesting too that we have all this conflict right now, essentially in the Proto-Indo-European homeland, right? Like, that's
yeah.
kind of bizarre in like a metaphysical sense. But if somehow, if we look at it as the path of contemplation in the East, well, and I don't believe that, they're not also subject to the laws of the Kali Yuga and degradation. But I do think in general, they've done a very good job of preserving the tradition.
Well, you
Whereas,
yourself have taken initiation into an Eastern
right.
tradition, and from what you've told me, it had a lot of value for you. So I think on an individual level, there's nothing wrong with that.
No, I think it's
But it's not our
very
destiny as a
valuable.
people.
Right. Well, in kind of looking at it again from the Grail quest angle, um, Parseval wasn't like, I've got to find a guru to get started. Where's my guru? I'm going to sit here and meditate till he arrives because the universe has aligned that for me and I'll take proper initiation. No, he saw some knights and he was called to action. And so I think that the Western man, like we have the consequences to answer for of our departure, but ultimately finding that in our own way in overcoming those conditions that we've created, then we access this regal principle to then carry back eastward, and eventually you can reach the equilibrium point. Because if we look at the West as a whole, it's kind of fallen, and here we are in, at least for myself, in America. And not to say that America should be the saviors of the world. Obviously, we've seen how that has gone. But in general, the Grail heroes, they're said to be called from all different nations, and nobody knows where they come from, and they just arrive because they feel this call to action. And I think as kind of a psychological and spiritual endeavor, this is at work already in the West. And so if we're all able to start kind of looking at it in that way, to where we're accessing these long lost elements of light and solarity within us, then necessarily we will, if we're following the imperial path, well, you can't go further west. We would have to go back east. And so possibly, is there some sort of union that could arrive from that? I don't know. We'll have to see. But I like the way it sounds.
I think what you said about Parsival, just he didn't sit around and wait for a guru. He had to take action. And I've always kind of thought that that really ties in with the whole concept of asking the question, which is
Yep.
very vague in the literature. Like, what is the question? Well, they can't tell you that because it's part of your journey to figure out the question, because to ask the question is to state the problem. And
Right.
once you state the problem, you have to act on it. It is your dharmic duty to fight to correct that problem. You don't ask the question, state the problem, and then say, well, I'm just going to go back to meditating. Good luck with that, guys.
Sure.
If you want to be a knightly hero, if you want to walk that path of the sun, you have to go out and you just simply fight in the service of what is right and just, much like the Templar Knights did, or many of these other esoteric chivalric orders. That was their philosophy. And I don't have obviously the East has their own story. It's not our story. And Evelyn notes this too. His view is that the psyche and the collective soul of Western man, especially Western European man, is one that is of an inherently warrior caste nature, predominantly. Obviously, not everybody is, but it's predominant enough that it kind of collectively gives us that impulse toward that path of action. And so, as you say, like, there is this karmic fatedness around us having to complete this. We went on the exodus. We took that spiral downward, and the circle will never complete. It's
Yeah, are you
not a
just going to
perfect
stay in the
circle. So
stay in
you
the
have
underworld, or are
to,
you going to go home?
right. And so you have to, at some point, have that alchemical reaction on some level, preferably multiple levels, that reverses the spiral up into what you were talking about the other day in regards to like the 5D thing, which I thought was a really interesting way to interpret the way that New Agers talk about that. I don't know if you want to get into that, but you certainly can if you want to.
Yeah, so I can't help but I don't subscribe to 99% of the things that a lot of the New Age community does, but it's interesting to see as like just kind of a channeling, I guess you could say. Like, they're getting these ideas from somewhere, and if you ask them, they might say they're channeling it from extraterrestrials or God knows what. But either way, there is some sort of fabric emerging, and it is certainly novel. It is certainly trying to accomplish something. And so I'm curious, where is that coming from? But they keep talking about this idea of a new Earth, and the new Earth being birthed and they always note it as jumping from like a 3D reality to a 5D reality. It skips the fourth dimension, which the fourth dimension is time. And I find resonance in this because in some of the authors that I like, this idea of being against time resonates with me. And I do think that it is ultimately the warrior's ambition to somehow defeat these conditions that um, if we look at the fall or the separation from source as an initiating point, it starts the clock, it starts time. And time is simply a measurement that accounts for this departure state. And in regards to the West, like we have ran down the clock of departure. We left where we began, and we followed our course, and here we are. And so we're kind of in this crisis moment of what do we do about it? And near as I can tell, there's a lot of online discussion: who's right, who's wrong. Everybody's pissed off, but nobody is yet to do much. And the Grail question is ultimately, whom does the Grail serve, or where is the Grail, right? So where is this power, and what is this power meant to be used for? As we can see, those who wield any type of power in this world are using it for ends that are not aligned to the majority of those watching this, I'd imagine. And so if we ask that question of where is this power, this divine force that allows for prosperity and goodness to prevail in these lands that we call home, if it cannot be found, then that's the call to action to find it and to embody and personify and uh, exemplify those virtues within oneself in order to align oneself with the path of locating it in its totality for where we're at to heal the land. Now, do I think we have a leader sitting around that's wounded that needs to be healed? No, I have other views about what we should do with our leadership. But I think in general, we have to take it upon ourselves to complete the great work, and that work necessarily is tied to the healing of our lands and our people. And I really can't see if that's not a reason to reach across the aisle, pagans, Christians, Dharma bros, whatever it may be, and say, look, we all see this necessity of restoring what has been lost. Then I don't know what else is.
So, what would you advise for people who are kind of considering their own individual spiritual quest? Because we've talked about what a dangerous path it is to pursue the Grail, and it's clearly not for everybody. So, who should pursue the Grail? And for those who shouldn't pursue it, what should they do instead?
Um, I'm a big advocate of looking into one's ancestry and finding what resonates with you. And I myself, I was brought up Christian, but I would not consider myself a Christian. But even though exoterically I would say I practice Germanic paganism, as that's predominantly my ancestry. There's an esoteric angle, I guess you could call the Greater Holy War, that is really where my spiritual path is at. And I think that the people that understand what that means and understand that you have your practices. You had Arvel on the other day, and he's very Platonic. He's a genius with Platonism, but he's a
Yeah, he's
practicing
really
Catholic.
smart.
But he's smart enough to understand that although he is a practicing practical Catholic, his spiritual path is not confined by that or to that. And so I think that's really the key for those that are able to see the kind of bigger play unfolding, to find a practice, which I would advocate for something that you have some sort of ancestral tie to, because I do think blood memory is a real thing. And to stay on that practice and to trust in that practice, but to also recognize that it is an approximate articulation of something bigger unfolding. And for those that are less inclined to that kind of that path of the esoteric element of your practice and the exoteric, that's fine too. There's really no reason why you can't again find a practice that is suited for you, that gives you practical value. What do people really want from spirituality? They want hope, They want some sort of community. They want some sort of divination sort of correspondence between a higher authority. And I think ultimately these things are present even in its fallen state of paganism, Christianity, the Dharmic religions. There is still a way to practice it that is true to tradition. It's just you have to put forth the effort to finding out what that is and being able to see through the bullshit of chat GPT sermons and things like this. So I would say those that feel a resonance with the call of the Grail, you probably do for a reason. And those that are like, this is just another recycled myth, it doesn't really matter. You probably don't feel it for a reason, and that's okay. But whether you believe the Grail is what caught the blood of the world redeemer, or you believe that your body is meant to encompass that cup itself, it doesn't really matter. You're still looking for the same substance. You're still trying to do the same work.
I think that really speaks to, what you said earlier about the Grail quester is called by name. Not just everybody is called to do this, and we don't actually need everybody to do this. We only need a few people who can do it and be successful. And I'm kind of the view that the entire fate of our people and the West and the world even hinges on the success or failure of those few people who are called by name.
Right. Yeah, I think so too. I if you again take it way back to this like primordial Hyperborean state, which again is going to be speculative to 99% of people, but for some weird reason, there's some of us that feel like it's not speculative, that we feel that there's this nostalgic memory of it that we can't let go of, and I think there's a reason for that, or we're all just schizophrenic, and either way, like it's larger powers than ourselves are at work and at play. But if there's this undifferentiated whole and then a splitting occurs, it's that splitting in like the Vedic hymns, it's Agni Rudra uh, ensures this splitting, and he shoots an arrow at Dyaus, and his arrow as Dyaus has fallen in love with his feminine principle and he's mating with her.
Mm.
And as the arrow hits, the seed of Father Sky basically spills upon the earth, and that's where humans rise. And so I think if we look at something that simple of like we have this inclination that we're not quite from here, we have some sort of essence about us that longs for something higher, but we're here. um, I would imagine that the divine sent some people on a rescue mission to help. And whether we call those fallen angels or the Nephilim or the gods or titans or whatever it may be, I tend to gravitate towards the idea that there were entities that came down here to try to walk the path of return to fix what went wrong. And you either feel that or you don't, and it's okay one way or another, because those who feel it really can't let it go, and they're going to keep pushing it.
I think that's something that a lot of people get stuck on because so many people are focused on proselytizing and
Right.
convincing everyone else to adopt their worldview, that we have to have just, everybody has to be doing the same thing. Like they need this external validation of their chosen path in order for them to, I don't know, like what does my participation in your path have to do with your success on it? I can't say, but they do seem to feel that. And I think it's really difficult, I think, for people to sometimes conceptualize that it is okay if this path isn't for you and some other path is. Like I don't think either one of us is suggesting that everybody needs to go on a Grail quest.
No. um I also think that most people, even in kind of the spheres that we operate in, do not like the full implications of the differentiation of human beings. Like, not everybody is created equal or thinks equally, and this is proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. But just because you are a tradesman and you have no impulse for some sort of martial activity does not make you any less integral to the whole of society or any less, you know, part of the folk spirit, really. It they're all integral because they're all ultimately from that undifferentiated whole. And the more we can remember that, but also not promote this type of, false elitism. If I'm a warrior, I'm from the warrior caste, or I'm a priest, I'm the guru, I know it all. These are all just egotistical things that are, again, products of our time and our age, and this infinite need for gratification, and for people to give us, some sort of attention. And those are all those, whether, regardless of what caste you would consider yourself to be, if we had caste, those are all the lead that has to be transformed. Those are all the lower parts of ourselves that we have to look at critically and examine and see, are they conducive with the dawn that we hope to see and we hope to bring, or are they just vestiges and residues of a fallen world that is on its last leg?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know how much time you have. I had a couple more things I wanted to ask you about, and then maybe we can take some questions from the audience.
Sure, yeah, I
Um,
got time.
I did want to ask you your thoughts on the role of the so-called daughters of the sun, or these korai, these
Mm.
female koros that accompany the hero on his journey to the underworld, and what you see as their role being, especially in relation to the Grail quest, what function they serve for the hero. Because a koros cannot even enter the underworld without a korai. Basically, the way that I have read it is it's his beloved that's inscribed
Right.
on the Grail. You cannot. There's initiation, right? There's the being able to sit in stillness and being able to clear your mind and have mastery over yourself, but that's actually a prerequisite to the underworld quest, which is
Right.
the next stage. And so you have to have already had that alchemical union, the hero with his woman, before you can go down in there. So I wondered if you could maybe say a little bit about that.
So there's reflexes all over the place with this idea. The Valkyries would be one that comes to mind, but specifically like the Swan Maidens, and this idea of these beautiful shape-shifting, sometimes described as semi-divine, or daughters of the sun, maidens that are bewitching in the best sense, that it's not this kind of like test of lust. It's just, yes, that is something that is a part of me, and I can't really put my finger on why. um it's this prompting in the hero to again understand the deeper work at play of reintegration of that primordial essence, which in a physical sense is extremely difficult to do, especially without the rationale to wrap your mind around. But if you're looking at it like, being a vessel for the fullness of being here on this plane, if it's the divine king role per se, uh, they've integrated or reunified themselves with that lost feminine principle that was the prerequisite before the fall, before birth, before material existence. And to accompany the hero Vola talks about how the Grail maiden, or the woman, gives the vivifying principle, the spirit to the quester, right? So if you think about it with the elements, you got the four elements, and the fifth element is spirit, right? And so that fifth element is really what is the motivating driving force, but it's a pure virginal love, essentially, for the unity before the idea of procreation, or before the idea of separation even entered into the fold. And these korai, these daughters of the sun, these maidens that prompt that nostalgic longing, are the spirit, the secret ingredient, the little elixir that was necessary to propel the hero to accomplish any task. It's like when Parzival is wandering through the woods, he's just in a daze. He's like killing people left and right, fighting, but he just, all he can think about is his beloved. He's in a daze because this is speaking to a higher love, an initiatory love, a love that is, what Serrano talks about, amor, right? So
The
this,
loveless love.
the loveless love, and this speaks to a state that is before any of this. This is that primordial essence of
The
being.
union.
And right, and so this kind of similarly with the idea of the sun being chased, right? This thing, this draw is on the run, or something, it's stolen, something happens where it's gone to the underworld, and the hero has to venture down there, but only by that vivifying principle that really solidifies their gumpture to even perform the task. Can they do so? And they do so in this almost ecstatic state or trance, because they're just entwined with the love. And really, this is, it's the a lot of times in like Christian tradition, they talk about God as love, right? But it's that kind of same idea of channeling that fullness of being, which here is a yearning for the love, which is why the eros plays into it and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that virginal quality is not what people maybe think it is, where they think of somebody who's never had intercourse, but it's
Right.
more, the ancients had a different conception of it. It could mean
Mm.
that, but it mostly just referred to a quality of unattainability, one who could not be possessed. So theoretically, it could have been a woman who, like, you see this with a lot of the ancient goddesses in like the Greek tradition and stuff. They are called virgin goddesses, but they have an awful lot of
Yeah,
lovers.
they have so many
Why are they
children. Yeah.
like, why are they called virgins
Yeah.
when they're clearly not? And it's like, it's not speaking to a physical virginity, it's speaking to a spiritual virginity, in that in none of these pairings was she claimed by a man, in the sense that woman is soul and man is
Mm.
seeking soul. And so, in order for her to be possessed, she has to almost be claimed as a soul of a man, and that hasn't happened. And of course, the Grail quester, upon finding his beloved and achieving the Grail, of course, also having this unattainable quality, you have to earn it.
Yeah,
Is a
you don't know
really
where it's at. You don't even know where the kingdom's at. You just kind of wander around in the days until you can
and
synchronize it all, I guess.
And this is, I think, this is what's meant by, put your faith in a woman, not in God. It's almost like saying, put your faith in your own soul. You just have to go find
Right.
it first.
Well,
Good luck, but it's out
and
there.
it's also, not in the totality of being sense, but it's beautifully articulated, like in the Bhagavad Gita, that
Mhm.
like that fragment of the imperishable, ineffable one lives inside of you, but we forget that, and we forget where it's at, and then somehow it becomes projected outward, and now we have to quest and find it. And the process of reintegrating that is falling in love with totality all over again. And this is personified by that unattainable woman, because it is no simple task to perform that action. Is, the alchemists called it the great work for a reason. um, but the pursuit of it is almost more important than the attainment, because it's living the dharma that is necessary of the hero, whether how many of the knights die on their quest, or even the ones that aren't on the Grail quest, they're simply just trying to win the love of a woman. Almost all of them. So the pursuit of the goal, this striving for the higher, I think, is really the deeper um, value to be gained. And at its best, religion seeks us to strive higher, to better ourselves, to better those around us, to better the world around us. And this impulse to obtain something lofty and almost impossible, maybe it is impossible, is still so enticing that the hero can't help himself. I will attain the Grail. And this is the impulse that is necessary for one that can be properly imbued with the spirit and essence of the Grail, because they're willing to do anything for essentially the whole.
Yeah, and that quality of, you chase it forever and you'll probably never attain it. Like, for the chivalric knights, the idea of ever like actually consummating a relationship with the woman they fancied, who may have been like some woman who didn't even know he existed, or who was married to somebody else, or was just, you know, even just like an abstract character of a woman in his mind, it could be. But the thing he feared was the consummation of that. And once that union comes together in a physical way, the tension that is meant to be there, that really impels his continued action forward, is suddenly dissipated, because it's never going to
Mm,
live up to the ideal in this material realm, like no physical woman ever actually could. All she can really do is be a catalyst for the archetypal form of that ideal woman represented by the Grail.
absolutely. And I think, superimpose the idea of the Imperium on that, right? Like, what is the likelihood of this incredible solar Chakravartin-led Imperium that, really fixes all the wrongs that we can't stand? Well, probably not the best, but is it anything less to strive for that? No. That, of course, that's the goal. Of course, that's what we should be pursuant of, because that's precisely what is the poetic value of the Western European soul. We are romantics, we are idealists, and that's where this whole kind of Promethean, Luciferian, Faustian angle has been, woven into our framework. Regardless of the truth of any of that, it's not damnation that's at stake. It's not living our full potential that's at stake. It's not singing the song at the highest octave of our being that is at stake. Because and I've said this to some of my closest friends, I would rather, you know, stand against the impending darkness, knowing for utmost certainty, looking at the fate, doing a horror, a horary chart, and knowing I'm going to die and know I'm going to fail, but still defiantly carrying the torch into that darkness because it's the right thing to do, than to give up at the last moment and say, somebody else can take over this dharma. I don't want it. So I think the Western man, were programmed in that way. The heroes of the West are.
Yeah, and that is ultimately the heroic quality. It's the ability to fight without regard for life or limb in the service of something higher. Not caring if you like, it's not about whether you win or lose that physical battle. It's about whether or not you were able to withstand even like the loss of your life, to
Right.
stand in service of that higher dharma, that higher truth. And the people who, I think they get really like black pilled, and it's just like, oh, well, the West is lost. Who cares? Enjoy the decline, accelerationism. And they don't seem to want to fight. They just seem to want to revel in their demise, which I find really disheartening. Along, well, many things in the modern world I find disheartening, including, the modern like gender warfare, for example, of, the men hate the women and the women hate the men. And it's like, well, if you really wanted to undermine the spiritual quest of Western man, you would
Yeah.
separate men from women. I mean, there are myths around, the splitting of men and women because it was too much of a threat to the gods. They were too powerful together. And it's like, well, now we have a system that drives us further and further apart with this really nasty discourse, such that men and women don't even want to be together anymore. Like, the spiritual repercussions of that are significant.
Right. There's something very bizarre if you're a man today and you don't feel the impulse to defend and protect your kin, or the woman that you love, or the broader folk that we would consider. Uh, to just idealize some sort of, complete collapse of that and not strive against it is very strange to me. It's almost like a self-flagellation, right? But it I don't think it's wise to not take a sober look and say, like, this is going to crash and burn. We know that. But to compromise the virtues of the Grail just because that's the case is precisely why people are looking for the Grail in the first place, is because all of our leadership already sacrificed those virtues, and now we're in a wasteland. So there has to arise those virtues again, which will always start with individuals. And this is the kind of self-initiatic quality of the Grail quest: is, do you feel that call or not? Now, what you do with that, what in my case, like, I went and sought out Vajrayana tantric initiation from a qualified guru, right? But I'd already been called to something higher, and I understand that as much as that is a valuable part of my practice, it's a tool in the tool chest. of a bigger holy war. And that to me is kind of the key of it all. Is, do you feel like you could do something, and if you did, why would you not want to do it?
Yeah, I feel like the one who is qualified to attain the Grail is not the person who would ever make any excuses for why it's too hard or why he's
Mm,
delaying doing it. The call in him would be so strong that he could not do otherwise. Like to pursue the Grail no matter what the external world throws at him, no matter how bad circumstances are, no matter how much of a lost cause it is. It's like he has to do what must be done and nothing will stop him. It's like his mind is just laser focused on that.
and,
And
you know,
that,
sometimes we need that Krishna and Arjuna moment that Parsifal
yeah,
certainly did, where it's like, "Get off your ass and fight." And it that's part of it, you know, and it's part
yeah,
of it to miss the Grail when it's seen, and to regret it, and to just, you know, have a sense of shame, and you see the world crumbling further before your eyes because of that shame, right? And it's all overlapped and woven into this tapestry that prompts action, and you feel the action or you don't. And some people aren't meant to, and some people are. I really believe that.
yeah, I do too. Um, well, I'll just put out to the audience if you guys have any questions for me or Jake, can you send them in now so that they are ready for us? Um,
Is this going to show up in this little private chat thing, or?
yeah, so if you look on your left side where you see comments, you'll see questions pop up, and then I'll put
Comments.
them on the screen for people, the ones that we choose. So one kind of like just to sort of like wrap this up, I guess, as we before we take any questions, you know, what is your view on how this broader initiatic journey into the underworld came to be linked specifically with the medieval Grail saga? I don't know if you even would know like the history of that, but it's something I've always kind of been curious about. If there are any, if you know
Yeah,
of any
and
sort of historical links between the two.
so I'm gonna butcher the Welsh, but in there's the Cauldron of Unwin, I believe, where in the Welsh tales, it's this underworld cauldron that the heroes must go reclaim, and it very much is like a Grail-esque object in that it provides abundance. It's said that only men who are not cowards and not oath breakers and basically loyal to the service of the land and the people can eat from it, and it gives the choice meats usually, right? Because it's warriors from its cauldron. It has abundance of plenty, but they have to raid the underworld to obtain it. And what's interesting is this cauldron has deep associations with the ancestors. Obviously, the ancestors are believed to be in the ground and live in the underworld. But the deeds of great men, the deeds and heroism of ages past, is all swirling around the broth of this cauldron. And so you have these new heroes that have to obtain this cauldron, meaning they have to obtain that same broth. They have to make their contribution to the cauldron in order to reap the reciprocity and the benefits of it, to give abundance to their kingdom, to their subjects, to the people in their charged in their stead. And so this this is very similar to, you know, going further back past the Irish and Welsh stuff in the koryos tradition of the uh, the koryos, or the leader of the warband, being expected to disperse the spoils of the conquest and to give very generously to his other fellow men in the warband, but also to the kingdom or the tribe in general. And when they were entering into this state of conflict and battle, they were basically undead, right? They're in this, you know, space between life and death, because they're on the razor's edge. They could die, they could be, you know, butchered or maimed or whatever it may be, but they were conquering death. So in that way, they were entering into the underworld, doing combat there, gaining the wealth from the underworld, and then bringing it back to be shared. You're muted.
How does that keep happening? I think
I
it's
think
like the
there's a
touchpad
button.
or something.
Yeah.
I just keep like brushing it. Yeah, that's really interesting. I've actually never heard about that before. I kind of feel like from a metaphysical standpoint, the journey into the underworld is almost like an like it's a necessity because we're in a fallen state. Like we've entered this realm of duality, and like you can't just look at the light half. You can't just look at one half of the equation. You have to bring everything back into unity. And that does mean going into the darkness, which, um, you know,
Well, in
it's
any
interesting
initiatic
that
quality, like
go ahead.
you in any type of, using it almost in this colloquial term, like initiation, you die to your older self, you die to what you were before that. And so whether that's the initiation from boyhood to manhood, or whether it's any type of guru disciple relationship, there's a part of you that's dying, and so that death and then resurrection is necessarily like a motif of the underworld.
Yeah, I think so too. Okay, well, I have quite a few questions here. So, I'll start with our super chat. Happy Plague Doctor. Thank you very much. He also joined the channel today, which I appreciate. He asks if either of us are familiar with Randall Carson on his work concerning sacred geometry. I know of Randall Carson, but I wasn't aware that he did work with sacred geometry. How about you, Jake?
I've never heard of him, but I'm gonna put this in my notes and look it up because I think it's sounds pretty awesome.
Do you know like Graham Hancock and his works?
Yeah.
He cites Randall Carson quite a bit in some of his works. So yeah, you
Okay.
might be interested. I'm interested to look up his sacred geometry stuff, even though I'm like really bad at geometry. I'm interested in it. Quite a few questions from people
That's cool.
asking you to speak more about your
And
experience
the
with
problems.
Vajrayana and the problems that you've had with it. Just a lot of general interest I'm seeing of people asking you to speak more about your Vajrayana stuff, which I
Uh,
would be interested in hearing about too.
Yeah, so I wouldn't really say I've had problems per se. I took while I was at university, I got lucky enough to go to a Buddhist event that was here in Tennessee, and Yangtze Rinpoche was coming in from Nepal, and he was leading a Green Tara initiation, and so I took initiation under him, and took the vows and the recitations and all that. It was pretty profound experience. It was, you know, uh, some people will not believe these sorts of things, but it's the truth, so I'll speak it. He, of course, is giving the prayer, and I'm just receiving the seed. It's kind of like planting a seed in you, and I started having, my eyes were fluttering. I definitely felt this kind of electric current sort of sensation, and yeah, it was a really moving and powerful experience that uh, I I continued to practice, although I've kind of rather than using specifically like the iconography and the names of the Tibetan deities, I've looked for their cognates in the spiritual practices that I already undergo. So primarily Germanic paganism. Um, Green Tara is, Tara in general is kind of like the mother of Buddhas. And so she's this benevolent, motherly, but also initiatory force. And so for me, I see a lot of cognate with Venus with that, and kind of like, obviously Eros, the cult of love sort of thing. So uh, I still make use of the Vajrayana practice. I just have kind of tweaked it for my own uses, with my own invocations and prayers.
Yeah, I know Vajrayana is becoming quite popular among certain segments of our milieu. Um,
I think it's worth noting like the history of Vajrayana Buddhism, because Buddhism was an outgrowth of Hinduism, which was an outgrowth of the Vedas, which were an outgrowth of the corded ware Aryans that went into India. So you have a lot of time and a lot of things changing. And once it gets up to Tibet, it mixes with the Bon tradition, which is kind of this indigenous Tibetan tradition. Um, so for myself, I'm a Western man. I prefer to work with the archetypes and the themes of the mythology that is part of my, it's already part of my psyche. I've been brought up with it, reading these stories, so it's part of who I am. And I don't reject any of the teachings of the Vajrayana. I think a lot of them have Western parallels. Zach Gill has some great books, Hammer and Vajra, which are worth looking into to kind of see the parallels of these things. But for my own practices, I tend to work within the current that is my own ancestry.
If that doesn't answer your guys' questions, you can feel free to give more specific questions, but we don't want to make Jake give his entire life history on one show. We'll bring you back for more of that, I think.
It's long.
All right. You speak of this hero and a rising call to action. Do you not think that mindset is hammered out of kids in school, etc.? In the UK, we can't even kick an intruder out of your own house.
I mean, yeah, it's definitely attempting to be, and there's obvious reasons for that. But that's, if you have children, that's all the more call to action for you to exemplify what that means. If you're capable of homeschooling, I would definitely say try and do that. But then you might have a weird kid that is like socially awkward. So I think it's just balancing the nonsensical bullshit that is being crammed down. I live in Tennessee, and like even in Tennessee, this is a massive fight right now. So I think it's the call you go. It's difficult. We have to be exemplars even more so, especially for our children. And so it's going to be worse and worse, battered out. But all the more reason to stand firm in it.
I agree with that. I think, the schools will do what the schools do, but we still have the ability to be good role models for children, whether they're our own children or just children in general of our people.
Right.
Got a nice little contribution from Shannon Moore, encouraging others to contribute for the effort in making this happen. Thank you, Shannon. I really appreciate that. I'm glad to see you here. I'm pretty sure I know who you are on Twitter. So it's awesome that you were able to show up. Next question. Do you have, Jake, any experience with Mahayana Buddhism or only Vajrayana?
I studied Mahayana Buddhism in college, but I only have ever really practiced variants of Vajrayana.
Okay. And Jenny asks, what is at the center of self-hatred and defeatism? Why does man entertain enemies within himself? Do you want to tackle that, Jake? I know, like for anybody who doesn't know, Jake also has his own practice with astrology, just like I do. Obviously, as I said at the start of the stream, we graduated from the same program. And I know that with the clients that I see, this is like a big theme that people come in with. They really struggle with this. So I'm curious to hear what your experiences with that have been and what your theories are on it.
I think principle among them is a lacking of authentic self-knowledge, and I think obviously the danger of taking on that task of knowing thyself is what you see a lot. And Acharya ji has spoken a lot about this, like, you are not God. It's these psychopaths that think that they are entirely God, which can be the end result of a lot of self-inquiry and a lot of self-study. And so, like, if you start on this baseline of self-hatred and loathing, you start making these practices and learning all this kind of esoteric wisdom, then all of a sudden you're like, I am God. I'm the solution to everything, which is definitely not the case. And so I think authentic self-knowledge of kind of who you are, astrology can most certainly help with, at least to point you in the right direction of walking your own path to figuring that out. But I would say if we really knew who and what we were and just how beautiful and precious that is, we could not possibly hate ourselves. But I think that also the time that we live in, there's a reason they're trying to push that so much. What kind of empowered person despises themselves? No, they don't. They just lock themselves in a dark room and wait for the world to end. So it's a kind of call to action on multiple levels right now. Like, we have to get back to the heart of who we are, and we have to embrace that and cherish it and preserve it at all costs, because that's our link to the divine, and that's our link to bringing about any type of goodness in this world. So I don't know if there's a single center of self-hatred other than really not properly understanding just how beautiful we actually are.
Yeah, and there's so much of, people comparing themselves to other people, or just like it's a complete lack of self-acceptance
Hmm.
sometimes. It's not seeing yourself accurately. And that doesn't mean to puff yourself up with ego, because that's also an inaccurate way to view yourself, but so is self-hatred. And you have to kind of come to that place of radical self-acceptance in order to pursue the kind of self-knowledge that you're talking about.
Well, it's also like, again, the idea of the sun and the moon, right? Like if you're associating with your inner composition with this degraded, disgusting form and you loathe that and you hate that, that's the light you're projecting into the world and everything becomes a mirror for it. So then you see more of it in the world and you hate the world all the more. And it's just this vicious cycle. And I'm saying this from personal experience because I've done it a lot.
Yeah, I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind. And I would definitely recommend to anybody, even if you've had an astrological reading from me, it's well worth getting one from Jake. He reads in a very different way
Thank
than
you.
I do. Um,
It's long.
and it is long, but I had one with you, and I loved the way that you kind of like go through the birth chart as a Grail quest story in and of itself. Um, Jake is a master of building these kind of stories, and so
Thank
do
you.
consider signing up for a reading with him if you're interested in that kind of thing. So, next
I appreciate
question. I thought the elites had attained the Grail, albeit without proper initiation process, and thus become corrupted.
it. No.
I have
So,
a feeling I know what you're going to say about that, but please go ahead.
So Avola talks about this too, and this is kind of like the rationalism. This is like the false enlightenment. The what was hearkened in with what the elites kind of super rationally got was this very gross and very disingenuine, like you could almost call it like an inverted grail, right? Like it's the means and mechanics to wield power in the world void of any type of spiritual authority, and that is obviously what is fated to happen in the Kali Yuga. So it's right on time, but no, the elites possess nothing other than their own delusions, and they'll pay for it.
I mean, at the risk of sounding like really woo woo, like I don't care. People call me that anyway, so I may as well just
Right.
own it.
We
But
we do
I,
astrology. It's part of the game.
yeah, we're sitting here talking about like dorky esoteric stuff that
Right.
nobody else in the world cares about. But my kind of feeling about that is that the elites are most likely using some kind of black magic. At
Oh yeah,
some level,
it's
they are. That there's and I remember reading like Serrano talked about like a corrupted Kabbalah,
mhm.
basically that, and he talks about the inversion of magic, and that like it's not the attainment of the Grail. It's really corrupting the Grail
So
essentially. But
if
that's
it's
where they're deriving
interesting
their
to
power from, is the black magic.
yeah, and like magic, the manipulation of energetic forms and like your ability to predict and time your actions within those currents is neutral. And a lot of people don't like to think that because they want it, well, if there's bad things happening, then obviously magic's bad and evil and all that. No, the usage of these tools is neutral. Even in like in tantric Buddhism, right? You have the cities and like you have these black magicians doing some crazy shit in the history of it, and they're not supposed to, but they got corrupted by the power. And it's kind of like, I'm not a big Star Wars nerd, but I do think that the idea of like being corrupted by the power of the dark side of the Force is basically what's happened. They have access, they have understanding, and they have been able to kind of hoard a lot of this knowledge and wisdom, and they can use it against us because of that. And there's remedial action, things like scapegoat rituals, right, where you can put the blame on somebody else and kind of dodge the karmic consequences for a time. So I don't think it's them possessing the Grail, but I think it's them wielding power in this world that um, ideally more good people will be able to counteract.
I agree. Leo's given us some clarification on Randall Carlson. Apparently, he's a builder and primarily works on sacred geometry. Yeah, I only knew him from the geology stuff, I guess. I didn't
Mm.
realize that he had that background. So now I'm going to, where someone else says you're going to go down the Randall Carlson rabbit hole,
Oh
and I
yeah,
probably
I'm
will
done for,
too.
man.
We're all done for. Let me see what else we have got here because I kind of like the things scrolled and I sort of got things out of order. How do we make all that into more of a trend? Jordan B. Peterson tried convincing people of going underground and slaying dragons, but the elite only need to break/ridicule movement head to end it. I'm not 100% sure I am understanding the question, Polish ambassador. Do you want to try to answer it, Jake, or should we ask for more clarification?
Yeah, I think he's trying to say, like, how do we make this more of, rather than just like theoretical, how do we apply it, right?
Okay.
Because
Let us
because
know, Polish, if that's not what you're asking, and we'll answer again. But go ahead, Jake.
and yeah, if that's the case, I mean, I really do think I get it. People are worried about being doxxed or whatever the fuck it is. Sorry to curse. It's annoying, right? Like we've gone through this period of like everybody's terrified of what's going to happen. Meanwhile, we've been subjected to like forced vaccines and being locked down, and the economy's crashing, and they're trying to get us on a digital currency. Like, at what point we're like, I don't know, maybe let's go camping together and just at least think out loud together. And I think a lot of people are doing that. I think a lot of people are trying to, have more in real life ways of diverting some of this, or at the very least weathering the storm. But I think that foremost we really do have to, it sounds goofy to say it like this, but again, it is part of it, looking at the lives we lead, even the mundane stuff, even the things that are not exactly like just awe-inspiring. There's not an actual dragon in the backyard, but looking at the things that take place in our lives within the mythic framework of a bigger narrative unfolding, and starting to look for those keys. And astrology is incredible with this because you can see when the planets show up, and it's kind of awe-inspiring. But we can take these steps to reclaim some of these lost art forms like astrology, like alchemy, and we can put them into practice in our own lives and start to see the veil start to thin, so to speak. And when you do that alongside other people, and this is the kind of idea behind the Koryos Academy, is having groups of people doing it together. When you all start to see it and you all start to experience it, not only do you have common ground to work upon, and you can help each other along, but it's validating. You're not the guy that just gets on 4chan every once in a while, but then you have to go to work and all the you have to be with all the normies or whatever you want to call it. Like, you're around people that are in the same mythic story that you are, because they were willing to take, like the tarot card of the fool stepping off the ledge. Like, just jump off the ledge. Like, let's jump into the myth and live the myth. And the more we acknowledge that we're living a mythic, poetic story, the more it becomes that. It's kind of like the attentive awareness of quantum physics, right? Like, we're giving attention and awareness to this thing that's unfolding. It's always been there, but now we're putting some spirit into it.
I have my Arthurian legend tarot, and the fool is depicted as Parzival.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's also like in the tarot, they say that basically the whole tarot is encoded into the Fool card, which makes sense because Parzival is the fool. He's just a dum dum wandering around, and Sonny figures it
I'm
out.
gonna have to have you back at some point to have like a proper discussion on tarot because it's something I've always wanted to know more about, and you're quite an expert on that too. And we'll
I'm not an
probably have to
expert.
have an astrology discussion at
I
some
have,
point.
I have to reference the guide every time I pull a card, but I do enjoy looking into it, like especially for the like symbolic value.
Yeah, it's a really interesting divinatory tool. Like I couldn't even begin to explain how or why it works, but it
Because
seems
of
to.
astrology. It works because of because the cards are astrological in nature. They have their deacons or whatever they rule and stuff, and that's when it gets kind of scary accurate.
Okay, interesting. I need to look more into that.
Hmm.
All right. I think there were a few other questions here. Okay, Jiminy Cricket asks if you uphold your Vajrayana vows to this day, and do you incorporate core Buddhist understandings within your framework like emptiness? Great
Yes,
question.
although I suppose the Vajrayana vows, again, like I've kind of had. It sounds weird to say tweaked them, but if you zoom out, right, from what a Vajrayana vow is, or what a Vajrayana initiation is, and look at what is trying to be articulated, what is trying to unfold, do I think that in my mind was planted a strictly Tibetan goddess that only resides in the Himalayas and that's all she, no. I think it's representative of something bigger than that. And so what that bigger representation is, I try and encode into my vows being upheld in a practice that is in accordance with the pantheon that I make use of, which is the Germanic deities. And so yes and no, I suppose. But I suspect that some of these questions might be arising from hardcore Vajrayana practitioners, in which case I would have to admit that I am not, that's not my path. I'm a Western European man in pursuit of the Grail. So Vajrayana Buddhism is part of it, but not in its original formulated way that I guess the more orthodox approach would be. I try and look at it as how does it uh, link into what I'm already doing.
As you
But yeah,
said earlier, it's a tool in
emptiness
your
is a big
toolkit.
part. It's a tool in my toolkit, and you know, I think the upholding the vows is and making use of these practices is an individual pursuit in general. Like, yes, a guru can guide you, and yes, there's specific framework to operate within for reasons of ultimately people's protection. But if you understand that and you have authorization from your guru to adopt it into your practice, green light's a green light.
All right. C. Stoddard asks, despite the obvious foremost works, are there any books and resources that you would like to recommend?
Yeah,
Oh, you guys get your pencils ready. Write this down.
Apollo the Wolf God. It's a monograph. I can't remember who it's. The Journal of Indo-European Studies is the publisher. I think you can still get it on Amazon. It might be kind of expensive, but you can probably find a PDF somewhere. That's a big one, just to kind of see like the way in which some of these themes play out specifically with Apollo and the koryos tradition. The One-Eyed God, Indo-European Manner Bund by Kershaw, very similar work, but obviously looks at kind of the role of Odin and the war bands in the Norse cosmology and all that. But it does a great job tracing kind of the koryos tradition. I have recently been reading Paradise Lost. I've been rereading that, and I've been enjoying that. Kind of a classic, just for the sheer beauty in the words, and obviously like the whole fallen angels element. Like there's some information there. What else? Strong Arms and Drinking Strength is a wonderful book to kind of break down the way in which Vedic society functioned with relation to ritual and the way that the ritual invoked and made use of the primary gods of Indra, Agni, and Soma. I think that for any type of, there's a lot of hate out there for quote unquote reconstructionalism, but tradition is meant to be updated for the age you live in. I'll put it that way. So I think if you can kind of understand the mechanics of things, it's okay to have a bit of experimentation in there, and the more you can kind of cross reference um, practices, the better. So those are the kind of books I got on my table at the moment. Other than that, anything by Serrano. I'm a sucker for Miguel Serrano, but with a grain of salt, obviously.
Okay. Is sacrificing animals or killing enemies part of the quest for the Grail? I suspect we may differ on this.
I don't know if I would say it's a part of it, but again, kind of like Arjuna mindset. Like if you have a enemy that you're trying to fulfill your dharma as a warrior, and the enemy's attacking you, like you have a dharmic duty to slay the enemy. They're already slain in Krishna, right? But I don't I don't really know about the sacrificing animals. If you're asking, do I sacrifice animals? No, I do not. I have a lot of farm animals. I might butcher a cow at some point because I do like meat, but I would probably cry about it because I hate killing animals.
I've always kind of felt like sacrificing animals is maybe not something that was originally part of our tradition, just from the basic principle that there are non-physical entities, whatever you want to call them, that are attracted to and feed on things like death and pain and suffering and bodily fluids, and that this is often the basis for black magic. And
It is.
so I have a really hard time reconciling that with, you know, what might have been our authentic primordial tradition. And I'm not convinced that sacrificing animals actually has a place in it. I know there are
Yeah,
people who feel really strongly about that one way or the other, but I'm just kind of like, what, like, is it attracting these entities to it, especially when you're considering like what we were talking about before with like the elites doing their black magic, some of the things that they've been accused of.
and drama
Well,
chrome or whatever it's called.
adrenochrome or something
Yeah,
like that. It's like,
it's probably
well,
real. I don't know.
if they are doing the horrible things that they have been accused of doing, those are acts that are spilling bodily fluids and creating an atmosphere of fear and pain. And it's going to attract a lot of these entities, which, of course, are always eager to make deals with humans.
Mm.
And it just doesn't sit right with me.
There's some pretty interesting, if you look at the original translations of the Old Testament, that Yahweh really likes the smell of burnt flesh. I'll just say that, like, there are entities, desert demons, if you will, that really would like the pain and sorrow and fear of something, and that I don't really want any alignment with. I do think that in like the traditional pagan world, it was seen as a replication of the primordial act or primordial sacrifice, and I do think that there could be, I'm not saying I condone it or could speak to it, could be ways to do that authentically, but I think that unfortunately is one of the things that may be lacking in any type of reconstruction with Indo-European paganism. But then you also have a lot of other things like mead, ale, butter. There's tons of things that are all always used. The pressing of soma, that are always used in these ritual contexts that don't require bloodshed. So I would gravitate more towards those and things like praises, hymns, and incense than bloodshed. For at least for my practice.
Where do you think this tradition within the koryos traditions came from, where they would slaughter their pet dog and eat it and wear
Yeah,
its pelt? Because that, like, maybe it's just my modern sensibilities or my
no,
female
I'm with you.
sensibilities or
Yeah,
what, but it just seems really dark, and it has that sort of shamanic quality of pulling up these abyssal
right.
forces of the underworld.
And I think the shamanic quality probably is part of it. Again, if it's traced back to kind of Siberian shamanism, ultimately, and animism. Now, it's worth noting that this ritual where they would sacrifice the wolves or dogs is hypothetical at best. There's no explicit
Okay.
sources that talk about this doing. It's what they believe took place, at least in this one site in Russia, which I can't really pronounce, but it's like Krosamonico or something. If you look up midwinter uh, dog sacrifice Russia, or let's see, the Wolf Rights of Winter is a good kind of academic journal on it. But this could have been one specific culture that was their variation of it. In general, we do know that the mammoth hunters did have domesticated wolves and dogs that they almost undoubtedly hunted with. So perhaps it was something along and this is also the same culture, the Malta-Barrett culture of ancient Siberia, where we find the myth of the hound guarding the underworld. It's like one of the world's oldest myths. So I do think that there's a deep ancestral connection to it, but I don't personally believe it was always this idea of killing the animal and then wearing it. I think it could have been just maybe if the animal passes or if it dies in battle or something, like it's dying on a hunt, to give it further life by incorporating it into one's hunting gear or battle gear, that kind of thing. So I would not kill a little doggo or a wolf, even to reconstruct an awesome myth. Yeah, couldn't do it.
It just doesn't feel particularly high vibe. You
No, it
know, if
doesn't.
we're trying to raise our consciousness to align with the divine, killing an innocent being just doesn't do it for me. I
Right.
feel like that would
I
pull me
do
further away from it.
I do think that if you're going to eat meat, which I know a lot of people, prefer the kind of like karmic reasoning behind going vegetarian and not vegan, but vegetarian, like in the Hinduism and all that. But if you're going to eat meat, I would advocate that you be the one to butcher the animal and take that responsibility because you've made the choice to consume it, right? So I think there is a way in which that can be done ritually and with respect to the animal if you've chosen to eat it. Like obviously, if you're hunting and you're taking an animal's life, you should give respect to that animal for giving its life so you can survive. But just sacrifice, you know, for the appeasement of deities, it's like, well, there's other things you can offer up.
Yeah, I have to say, like, I've noticed in myself, I generally, like, my preferred diet would be to be mostly vegan. It's just what I prefer. And I did feel like spiritually better doing that. And now that I'm
Mm,
eating meat again, I have noticed like that kind of subtle shift into that more Rajasic energy, which has its own benefits and drawbacks, but it is what it
right.
is. So, next question. Any thoughts on the Buddhist idea that all things, including the Grail, are impermanent?
This is assuming that the Grail is a physical object, right? And again, this would, in Buddhism, part of the reason I would not consider myself a Buddhist is because um, philosophically, I just simply disagree with some of the tenets of it. I don't fully walk that path, but I think there's a lot of value in it. And ultimately, I think some of these uh, real heavy hitting ideas on just nothing has an everything is without form and I don't stand by because I do have a more kind of platonic view. I think there is a higher realm of divine intellect where these things are predetermined in the physical world of Maya and illusion and everything that's subject to these laws. Absolutely everything is without form, everything is just we just agreed upon a capacitor and named that capacitor for the flow of consciousness for a given state of time. And I fundamentally agree with that, but I tend not to focus too heavily on it because the idea of the Grail is this imperishable primordial current that comes from the source that then occupies an object in order to dispense its abundance and ultimately in a dharmic fashion uh, dispense that abundance throughout the kingdom. And so I don't know if that would even have a form because it's a metaphysical immaterial substance to begin with.
Yeah, I think when it's something that's related to the eternal in that way, it's not really part of materiality. I mean, of course, the Buddha tried to go even beyond the level of Brahma.
Right.
So we could, I mean, you could get into some subtleties about that, but I think you answered the question well. Um, do you think there is a difference between an enlightened being and a deva, such as those in Germanic cosmology?
Well, I'm not going to get in too much onto the word deva because there's been some philological, back and forth about are the devas demons or gods or what, and there's a lot of political underlying things there. But I do think ultimately there are kind of, I guess you could say, kind of like Arvel was saying the other day, the younger pantheon of gods, which are responsible for the administrative ordering of our cosmos, where we live and dwell. And I do think that they are ultimately derived from a higher intellect, a higher, more perfect understanding of these things, but they are necessarily fulfilling the actions of it in accordance with their own, predetermined archetypical forms, if that makes sense. So whether we call that enlightenment or not, I would say it's under the jurisdiction of this archetypical energy that has a higher substantiating force that is informing it. And my understanding of, I guess, what it would mean to be, enlightened is to allow that force to pass and work through you without associating yourself with it. So in that way, yes, they would be enlightened beings, but I think it's kind of just you know theoretical wording at best to say this is what enlightenment is. This is somebody that's awake. to me, I think it's to let this higher mind work through you, because whatever that is more perfect than you are, and that would include deity.
Thanks. So next we have Conan send a super chat. Thank you, Conan. Either of you have an opinion on Carlos Castaneda's writings and the use of certain plants for the purpose of going on a spiritual quest of sorts, valid path or fool's errand? I suspect you might have a fair bit to say on that.
I'm not familiar with Carlos, but I have myself worked with psilocybin mushrooms, and I've worked with ayahuasca before. I don't think just at the onset either are necessary. I don't think that this is the only way you can, walk a spiritual path. And I know that some people would be adamantly against them, and their reasoning behind that is probably sound. For me, it was something I was called to. It was something that I wanted to be taught by. And I do think that the earth itself, again, I am ultimately like a practicing pagan, so I think the earth has a tremendous amount of wisdom. And even drinking chamomile tea, right? Like chamomile tea on a subtle level affects me energetically. It's just the reality of that substance operating in my body. And I think that there are more intensive forms of plant life that have a little bit more wisdom to share than just these, very subtle kind of energetic influences. I will say that as far as ayahuasca is concerned, I think that it's considered basically snake medicine, right? So for white people going down to South America and experimenting with this, I think we have perhaps a different task. A little bit more along the lines of slaying the dragon rather than being devoured by it. But that's just my own pet theory, and I did have a lot of benefit by that experience. But I think in general, things that are more rooted in our own geographical areas, if you're wanting to work with, those would be better plant teachers. But in no way, shape, or form are they, the only part of the spiritual path.
Yeah, I'm also not super familiar with Carlos Castaneda, only just kind of on a surface level. I know there are a lot of questions about his credibility and whatnot. But in regards to the plants, I mean, for myself, it's a tool that you can use, and not everybody should use it, and it should be used, with purpose, not every time that you're doing it. It's something that I've used very sparingly myself, but
Mm.
and I think because I've used it very sparingly, I've had good results with it. I've never had an issue with it, but I do know people who have. So I'm really like cautious to ever recommend it to somebody. I feel like it's one of those things, like if you really strongly feel the call, then answer the phone, but otherwise just leave it.
Right. You're not going to become enlightened by dropping acid every day. Like you're going to be brain dead. Anything like that applies to, any type of uh, psychoactive plant. It can be a useful tool, but I would not say it's the only gateway.
Yeah. And super chat from Thunderstorm. Thunderstorm, I don't think you've ever missed one of my live streams, and it's so lovely to see you show up every
Hmm.
time. I really appreciate that you're here all the time. He says, according to the old ladies that taught me about the old folk ways, we didn't sacrifice animals. Oh, also hell is the goddess of kindness. When you say hello, you're wishing kindness. Interesting. I didn't know that. Thank you for that
Look,
tidbit. And from Sam, who we both know, he asks, can either of you speak more extensively about the win-lose dichotomy role in defeatism and the ultimate context of win-lose? I don't know about you, Jake, but I see win-lose as a very Marsy thing. Mars really
yeah,
thinks in
knowing
terms
Sam's
of like
chart,
win and lose.
knowing
Yeah,
Sam's
Sam,
chart, I know
he's a
where it's
Marsy
at.
person.
Well, yeah, we have the
Um,
same placement. Yeah, it's that competition element is inherent. But it
you've
is,
got a pretty potent Mars yourself, and so do
yeah,
I in some ways.
yeah. It's I suppose when you're saying in the role and defeatism and the ultimate context of win lose, uh, I think the ultimate loss would be not fulfilling your dharma, not fulfilling your role that you were here to fulfill. And there's a process to better understand that. And yes, you could seek out things like gurus, you could seek out astrology. There's a lot of tools at our disposal to kind of align yourself within your path. But to not pursue that path once it is located with everything you've got, that's the only real loss I could see. That's just kind of my personal take on it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. And if you want to kind of clarify your question a little bit more, Sam, I don't know if you're referring to something specific that you want to know about, but feel free to ask a follow up if you do. So next one, what are your and his thoughts on sex magic? Well,
You
how
want
to
to go?
discuss this and
Yeah.
keep this
Hmm.
PG rated?
I th- I
I
think
think it's a legitimate path. I will say that, but you go ahead, Jake, and I'll build off what you say.
I likewise think it's a legitimate path. I also think it's inherently extremely dangerous path, because ultimately what you're working with is the problem itself, right? Like the problem of division between unity and the repercussions of that division and the state of affairs due to that. And so, is there a way in which it can be utilized that is working on those higher levels of awareness and working on this kind of reintegration? Sure, but I think the majority of modern, tantric sex practitioners, like especially in the Western world, are leading people very much astray, and I would caution against it.
Many of them are outright predators.
Yeah, it's just like, look,
It's not a good
orgies are the
comparison.
way to enlightenment. Clearly, it's like, no, you're
That's
just
very
get
Dionysian, and it's often just really wrong.
right.
But I do think it's a legitimate path, and I've kind of considered, that it's possible that it may be like it is really in line with that sort of left hand path, the setting sun, all of the things that we've talked about. It does fall in line with that really easily, and it's
Yeah,
essentially using a physical woman as a catalyst for this alchemical great work within, and it can be very effective, but as you say, also very dangerous. However,
it's the spear that wounds or heals ultimately. So it's like, in
well,
the
it's the
Grail quest,
Grail, right?
right? And so I would say that there there's definitely merit there, and especially, in an alchemical sense, like it's the lead you're trying to turn to gold. So in the state of affairs that we have at such in the Kali Yuga, where lead is it's real lead, you know what I mean? It's heavy, it is dross, it is about as degraded a form of lead as it can get, but it's the lead we have, and so there is merit to trying to u- use it operationally, I would say, but yeah, definitely with a massive amount of caution and very selective partner. Like you, if this,
It's not something to dive into just because you think it sounds like fun. You really should probably know what you're doing before you
yeah,
get too involved in it. Because as with every left hand path, once you set out on it, turning back is not an
you
option, which
can't.
is ultimately why we can't return to the east. Turning back is not an option on our left hand path. You will either succeed or you fail. And if you fail on the left hand path, you disqualify yourself from ever having success on the right hand path. You can't be
Hmm.
like, oh, this was too hard. I'm going to go take the dry path now and I'm just going to follow devotional religion or whatever. Like you've angered the gods to that point that they will not allow you success on any path. So you
Right.
have to keep going and you have to have that fortitude. I have kind of considered that, as we get deeper into the Kali Yuga, not saying we're there yet, but as that happens, more and more doors close to us being able
Mm,
to seek spiritual realization. But I don't believe that it will ever be fully closed. I do think there will be like an unguarded path, like the back door into Mordor kind of thing. Um, and that unguarded path may very well be a kind of sex magic in the sense that no matter how depraved the world gets, people are still going to continue having sex. And
right.
it's not outside the realm of extreme possibility that somebody could accidentally stumble upon a path to transcendence via this method when every other pathway has been lost to the darkness.
Yeah, Avola
So,
talks about that in was it Path of Awakening or whatever that book's called, and
Doctrine
he
of
kind of,
Awakening.
yeah, Doctrine of Awakening is kind of alluding to that at the close of the Kali Yuga, only the most base things are the things that can be giving of liberation. I don't know how I feel about that, but I do think that for the mass amount of people in the world, yes, like right up until the very end of the close of the curtain, they'll probably be still having sex. So maybe within that, a sliver of people will try and find a deeper value set there.
Yeah. So, I mean, we could probably spend 2 hours just talking about that topic in and of itself. James asked, weren't the people the koryos killed and raided also innocent beings? I feel like that kind of goes in with like the whole like battle that Arjuna fought, where Krishna says
Yeah,
like
that's exactly what I was
it's their
thinking.
dharma. Like I've already decided that they're going to die. Like that's just simply their fate, and you're only my tool to carry it out. Not that I condone going around killing people, but it's not being done in the context of a ritual sacrifice, and I
Right.
think that makes a difference.
I think also we don't live in the Bronze Age. We realistically, like any type of modern idea about the koryos would most certainly not involve going around just killing people. But at the same time, if we have an existential threat that emerges, and you are defending your woman, you're defending the virtues of the Grail and the goodness that's still left in this world. I don't I know I won't possibly be a type of person to just sit down and meditate and accept it all. I would fight to the last breath, and that's just who I am, so that's what I'm pursuing.
I'm definitely picking you to be on my team for the apocalypse. I will say that.
Well, we're in it
John Kober asks, why is Western thought too rigid / masculine, unbalanced?
because of the age of reason and enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and all of this just very lame
Ultimately, the
shit.
abandonment of spirituality and
Yeah.
the abandonment of the feminine principle in a healthy way, I think is important to qualify it like that.
Mhm.
Um, looking for just so you guys know, if you want me to read your comment, I need to see it. So either tag me or a super chat, something to get my attention. Speaking of, Happy Plague Doctor recommends Robert Seffer.
Not into Robert Seffer very much. I think he does some interesting stuff, but it's the same video every time. I'm gonna feed these ducks. I'm gonna just kind of put some vague slideshow together. I'm gonna talk about sex magic and the Templars and Antarctica, and then we'll see you next week.
Yeah, I would like a little bit more substance from his work because it often just brushes over the surface, but doesn't often point you to where you can go to look
Right.
deeper into it. Okay, so Sam follows up and he says, I mean that people feel defeatism because they know they will lose in the end and that there's no emotional or intellectual cope that can right the wrong of losing. Loss is death.
That's the self-fulfilling prophecy, brother. Like you've convinced yourself of it, and therefore it will be. You gotta change your mindset. And I hate that. Like change your mindset, get on the grind set mentality of today. But like realistically, yeah, if you see the world as not beautiful and not worth fighting for, or that it's doomed to failure, like that's what you'll operate under those circumstances. You'll you'll work towards them, you know, subconsciously, and that's not the right way.
Yeah, I do agree with you. It's like nobody wants to hear the whole change your mindset thing because it sounds so cliche now. Every influencer says that, and it's like, what does it really mean? But it's ultimately like changing your mindset to understand that defeat ultimately doesn't matter. Because it's not about the external win or loss.
It's
You
about
can you
the
can
impulse to
lose.
strive.
Yeah, you can lose on this plane to gain a victory on a higher plane.
Right. And you
And
will
that's
ultimately, like you're going to die. Like you will die. It will happen.
yeah,
That's a
none of us
loss.
gets off this ride alive.
But did you live up until that moment?
And
That's what
and
really.
really live, yeah. I found a question here that got missed, and it's actually a question that I wanted to make sure to ask you before I let you go. Can you talk more about the Koryos Academy and the Grail quest that you offer? And also, can you please tell us about this retreat that you're running in July? I think you also have a few spots left available for it. And frankly, if I were a man, I would be going. It sounds really cool.
Well, first of all, if you are whatsoever interested, I haven't made it unavailable yet, but just shoot me an email instead because I have to get permits for us being out in the woods, and I'm not sure, although I have slots available still left, if I can get the permits for them in time. So before anybody tries to submit payment or anything like that, I don't want you to, do it without reaching out to me so we can make sure that you can attend. But uh, in short, nature is inherently therapeutic. Nature is inherently rooted in, cycles and seasonality that we often detach ourselves from. But when we enter back into for extended periods of time, we can kind of reset our own cycles and really start to access those higher forms of ourselves, and detach them from, what we're so bad in the modern age of just we're basically walking cyborgs already. We're always online. We're always, just engaging in these external things, but we're never really just in the moment. And so that's the main goal. We're gonna be out there for 9 nights on the one that's in July 9th through 17th. Why 9 nights? We're kind of doing like the Odinic wandering model, if you will. So there's 9 realms on the Yggdrasil tree, which correlates basically to the chakras, or if you look at things like the Kabbalah, there's centers of your being that have associations and archetypical energies with them. And so we'll kind of map out each day to address those, but also integrating ourselves into this rather difficult trek through the woods. I think our first hike, the very first day, is going to be about 11 miles up a mountain. But the reward is we'll be underneath the stars, free from any type of light pollution. And so we'll bounce around in Appalachia and practice some navigation skills, bushcraft skills, how to set up camp, and in general, this is to kind of get you more comfortable with what you're capable, and to get people into a state of not just physical preparedness where they know I can survive in the woods for a week and some change, and find my way around and I'm okay, but also to couple that with some spiritual questing, if you will, because again, it's looking at the landscape for what it is on multiple levels. Yes, we'll be in Appalachia, but the Grail can be found in Appalachia.
I did put the link to your website in the description for anybody who's interested in signing up
Cool.
or asking questions. So you're running this in July. What were the dates that you had available for this?
Yeah, so there's July 9th through 17th, 9 night course, and then there's like kind of a condensed version, which obviously it's pretty difficult for people to get off 9 nights from work, and if you have kids or whatever, make sure they're all right. So the 3 day is just kind of a condensed version of that. It'll be a little bit more intensive, but obviously less time, and that's from July 22nd to the 24th. So the first one coming up will be the 9 night, and it's open to men only at this time period. I don't really feel qualified to give too much advice to women, to be honest. I feel like men, in particular, uh, men of the West, are very scrutinized and very overlooked at the moment. And I think the more we can come together and work to find the authentic elements of ourselves that are somehow hidden in the underworld, then we'll probably be better suited to uh, encounter whatever's coming in a way that we can ultimately have victory.
Yeah, I have so many male clients who come to me and they're looking for exactly that. So I was really excited to see that you were offering that. So if people want to book, they need to go through your website, correct?
Yeah, and just because I have got some questions about the cost of it. For every person that attends, your permit to go out there and hike is paid for, all your food's paid for, and some of the gear will be provided too. So like I'm pretty much making breaking even on all of these, but I think it's the holy work, and I think it's worth doing. So I wanted to put that out there too. But like I said, the permit is kind of the main thing right now. Of course, the government hates any type of individualism. So we need to, if you're interested in signing up, just email me. Contact is on the website first. And then tomorrow I can make sure that there's permits available. If there is, then we can move along. But otherwise, you'll have to wait to the next one.
Okay, so if people can't make it for July, you will be running more in the future?
Yeah, I'd like to do at least one more this year. I'm kind of playing around with the dates and the regularity of it because, again, in order to
Weather
get the
dependent?
permits set up, well, weather dependent doesn't matter. What rain or shine or snow, we'll be out there. But it's really being able to have the permission to be out there. That has to be done pretty far in advance. I can't really justify paying for all the permits in advance when nobody's signed up, right? So it's kind of getting that
Right.
timing right. That's a bit of a kink at the moment, but eventually the goal is to have like 500 acres of my own and just do this full time.
Well, it sounds really exciting. And if any of you guys go on the trip, I would love to hear back from you what your experience was like. I can't think of anybody more qualified to run something like this. So I hope it's a big
Thank you.
success. And we have one last question. It looks like projecting astrology forward, are the stars positive for Western kind?
Define positive. Interesting. I think you can look at a different different nations' birth charts. For America, and I think we already know this. Like financial system is being hit pretty hard and is going like a lot could be coming of that. Obviously, we got the war, and then movement with China and all that. But the one thing that I come back to is America's founders encoded rebirth and revolution in the birth chart. And so, what that looks like moving forward is anybody's guess. But uh, the sun will always come again. It will always rise. But that requires people putting in the work.
Yeah, the US birth chart's pretty interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens to the US over the coming years. I don't do a ton with mundane
Aliens,
astrology
apparently.
myself. Yeah, maybe or alien hoaxes more likely,
Yeah,
but
that's the likely one.
we'll see. We'll hope for the best, and hopefully you'll get a number of good quality young men out there to build themselves up and develop the qualities that they need to lead us out of this mess, hopefully. So I think that's
It'll happen.
everything. So thank you so much, Jake, for
Yeah,
coming
thank you.
on. And I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. It was a great conversation. Everybody seems to have loved you and is asking for you to come back. So I'd
Be
love
happy
to
to.
schedule something else for the near future.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for everybody that tuned in. Thank you very much. And yeah, if you want any questions or want to just get a reading or anything, or I have a habit of just talking to people. So just shoot me an email and we can get on the phone.
Yeah, Jake's a very approachable person. You can tell because he's willing to talk to me. So yeah, check out his website. As I said, it's linked in the description. I put your Instagram there as well, which is kind of your main social media platform that you use. I think it's your only one. And
Yeah, I'm just lazy with it.
yeah, you're not a big social media person. So, but
No,
that's
I live in the
it's
middle
probably
of
a good
nowhere
thing.
for a reason. Like, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Well, you guys check that out. And thanks for attending, everybody. We will talk to you next time. Have a good one.